Amit Bhandari, Vice Admiral G. Ashok Kumar, and our Commandant, Vice Admiral Puneet Kumar Behel. While a regular seminar theme and sub theme has its merits, there is nothing more invigorating than the format of a panel discussion, where subject matter experts are able to exchange their thoughts and deliberate on concepts, ideas, and events. Panel discussions are lively, interesting, and extremely informative, and the upcoming one is no different. Do not miss the post lunch panel discussion on key enablers for India as a regional maritime power to ensure stability, security, peaceful coexistence, and development in the Indian Ocean region, featuring Vice Admiral G. Ashok Kumar, Rear Admiral S. Y. Srikhande, Professor Srikant Kondapalli, and Dr. Darshana Barua, and skillfully steered by Admiral Arun Prakash. Right then, ladies and gentlemen, here we are with session 3. To commence the proceedings, we have a moderator who aptly embodies the disposition of the phrase scholar warrior. I have the honor of introducing Vice Admiral Pradeep Chauhan. During his career spanning 40 years, Vice Admiral Pradeep Chauhan commanded several of the Indian Navy's frontline surface combatants, including the aircraft carrier INS Virat. The Admiral has served as the Assistant Chief of Naval Staff for Foreign Cooperation and Intelligence, the Chief of Staff of the Western Naval Command, and the Commandant of our very own Indian Naval Academy, Erimala. He was honored thrice by the President of India for the sustained excellence of his service to the nation. Since his retirement, he has published over 95 professional articles and papers in various Indian and foreign journals and magazines. Apart from being on the visiting faculty of the higher command establishments of all three defense services and also the tri-service establishments such as the College of Defense Management, Hyderabad, and the National Defense College, New Delhi, he has also been advising the government through the National Security Council Secretariat and the Joint Intelligence Committee. He enjoys international fame as an incisive strategic analyst and is a respected advisor and fellow of several important think tanks, including the Ananta Aspen Center, the Forum for Strategic and Security Studies, and the Center for Advanced Strategic and Security Studies. He currently serves as the Director General of the National Maritime Foundation. I am privileged and pleased to invite Vice Admiral Pradeep Chauhan to formally open our virtual stage and take over the proceedings of the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Right at the outset, let me say thank you for the very gracious and kind words. Also, I would like to apologize for my somewhat toothless appearance today because I'm having some major dental restoration done. And consequently, if you've watched the film, How to Tame Your Dragon, that's how you do it. Vice Admiral Puneet Behel, AVSM, VSM, Commandant of the Indian Naval Academy, Erimala. Admiral Theophilus, the Deputy Commandant. Admiral Rajveer Singh, Principal. Members of the faculty, divisional officers, and most importantly, all our young cadets. Good morning. This is very nostalgic for me because the high point of my life has actually been the fact that when I was commissioned into the Indian Navy, I was commissioned through the finest academy that India had to offer, and that was the National Defense Academy in Khadakwasla. And when I retired from the Navy after a good 40 years or so, I did so from the finest academy that India had to offer, which is the Indian Naval Academy at Erimala. So I am, as they say, well trained. Now, this morning's session is to do with maritime challenges and their impact on maritime security challenges and their implications upon India. And I would like to begin my introduction with a few moments of comment Let me begin by making an unequivocal assertion. Over the next 2 centuries, the next 2 centuries, ladies and gentlemen, are going to be centuries of the seas. And India will have to learn how to dance upon this maritime stage with verve, with vim, with skill, with adeptness, with adroitness. Only then will we be a true maritime power. Now, to sum that up, what I did want to say is that over, not after, but over the next 200 years, India will either be a maritime power or India will not be any kind of power at all. And therefore, the current obsession with the trans-Himalayan boundary is, I'm afraid, merely a transient distraction from the actual future theater, which is going to be the maritime expanse that we call the Indo-Pacific. Now, in this, when we talk about maritime security, it's very important to be able to parse the term correctly. There was a time when security meant merely an incessant competition for military superiority within a group of states arranged in largely an anarchic fashion. This, however, is no longer the case, and the government of India, in common with the government of many other countries, recognizes today that there are many dimensions to security, and military is one of them. Arguably, it's the most important one, but nevertheless, it is still only one amongst several others: economic security, human security, and so on and so forth. The other part is that similarly, the word maritime encompasses far more than merely the Indian Navy, Indian Coast Guard amalgam. Maritime is much larger than that, and naval security and naval issues are a subset, a critical subset, perhaps the most critical subset but yet a subset of maritime security. So when we talk about maritime security, we are one of the few nations on the planet Earth that is blessed by a prime ministerial clarity of statement. When the Prime Minister of India, who, like all prime ministers, cannot be denied, the Prime Minister of India stated quite unequivocally, once again, that maritime security is freedom from threats arising in the sea, or from the sea, or through the sea. And these threats could be man-made, they could be traditional, they could be non-traditional. Traditional security threats would include, of course, geopolitical constriction, and they would include state-on-state conflict, and non-traditional threats would incorporate all the things that you're familiar with, ranging from piracy to maritime crime to terrorism and so on and so forth. They could also be natural, which is security threats could become natural threats, tsunamis, sea quakes, and things of that nature. Or for that matter, they could be combinations of the two, and that leads us to climate change, which is probably the most ubiquitous of all the various threats in the maritime domain that India currently faces. Insofar as hard security is concerned, we must appreciate once again that India's security is really a function of two major pillars. The first of these is the blue economy, and the second of them is hard security. And both these pillars must rest upon a framework, a legal framework, which is robust and versatile, in which your national or your municipal or domestic law is entirely reconciled with your duly ratified international law. And this requires maritime security specialists to actually delve into areas that were otherwise considered to be the domain of academia, namely the whole business of public international maritime law. Now, as far as we are concerned, in India, we have now to contend with two Indias. One is a continental India with an area of 3.2 million square kilometers, and the other is a maritime India with an area of 3.2 million square kilometers once your extended exclusive economic zone and the extended legal continental shelf processes are completed. So India's major challenge will always be one of balance. How do we balance the geopolitical continental imperatives of India versus the geopolitical maritime imperatives of India? And in all this, we have seven major threats that we have to worry about, and which offer themselves to us as challenges, and to people like you, they offer themselves as opportunities. These seven are perhaps, I often say them as being major challenges, one for each day of the week. And they start with territorial integrity, they go on to geopolitical constriction, as I said. Then you have this whole business of security impacts of climate change. What about trade dependence and the disruptions to our trade? There's territorial integrity, there is terrorism, there is piracy, there's maritime crime. We have a huge amount of energy dependence, which forms a challenge all by itself. And then there is, of course, the threat all the time of interstate or state-on-state conflict, because we live in a tough neighborhood. We have a few neighbors and we have plenty of hoods. So perhaps the most ubiquitous of all these is, of course, the rise, the assertiveness, the aggressiveness with which China is now asserting and stamping what it hopes to be its footprint on areas which expand to an extent far greater than that encompassed simply by the Indian Ocean. And to talk to us about all these things and afford us their perspectives of considerable consequence, we have a stellar panel comprising perhaps the most bright luminaries in our strategic constellation. It is therefore with great pride and privilege that I am able to introduce the first of our panelists, Professor Srikant Kondapalli. Now, as you all know, Professor Kondapalli is the Dean of the School of International Studies and a professor in Chinese Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. He's been the chairman of the Center for East Asian Studies in the School of International Studies of the JNU for a number of years and demitted that particular office only 2 years ago. If you talk in New Delhi and indeed in the Indo-Pacific, and I dare say on the planet Earth, about China, you cannot but include Professor Kondapalli as one of the doyens of this particular academic approach and academic support to practitioners such as you and me on the issue and subject of China. He is a Chinese language expert. He learned this at Beijing itself. He's been a postdoc visiting fellow at the China Institute of Contemporary Relations in Beijing. He has spent almost an equal amount of time in Beijing as he has spent in India, and from time to time, and both countries, he's required to flash the credentials that he has to prove that he's actually from the other one. As far as we are concerned, he's our jewel in our crown for China studies, and he currently, of course, is the recipient of the K. Subramaniam Award, which he won about a decade ago for excellence in research in strategic and security studies. He hasn't stopped ever since that point. He is on the guest faculty and a fellow of mine in several of our think tanks, starting from, of course, the Vivekananda International Foundation, but also including all the think tanks of the Indian Armed Forces, starting from CDM to NDC and going on to higher command colleges of all our defense forces. He is a PhD guide with more than 30 PhD doctoral students who have emerged from his under his tutelage to be the new vanguard of Indian strategic thinking on China. So I think if I continued with his biodata and the books he's written and the periodicals and the monographs, then I will be guilty of consuming the entire morning's session. So without further ado, let me turn the proceedings over to you, Srikant, and regale us all once again and educate us with the virtuosity and the entire range of, formidable range of your knowledge. So it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Vice Admiral Pradeep Chauhan, for those kind words of introduction. And let me thank the Commandant, Admiral Puneet Bahl, the Deputy Commandant, and ladies and gentlemen. Today we have a huge set of presentations. My focus is on China. Let me begin by saying that China today is the second largest economy in the world at around $16.9 trillion, about $17 trillion. And much of this is on the high seas. So that is where China's maritime strategy is a very important subject that we need to focus on. Let me give a background of the resurgence of China in the maritime domain. While historically China has been, as a famous Chinese historian said, Chinese were landlubbers. A Harvard historian mentioned once. But today they are focusing mainly on the maritime domain. Of course, they have had the Admiral Cheng He's 6 expeditions to the Indian Ocean way back in the 13th, 14th centuries. So that memory is being revived in the Nanyang, the concept that the Chinese have been proposing since the 19th century. Today, as China is rising, their dependence on the high seas has increased substantially. Let me rattle a few figures here that are of relevance. China is the world's largest producer of over 200 categories of industrial products, including steel. A few years ago, they produced 830 million tons of steel. That's about 51% of the global production. They produce some 24,000 million tons of cement. Again, about 54% of global share in cement. And automobiles, they are now the largest in terms of the automobile production. So when the Hambantota port was opened, one of the first consignments to land in Hambantota was the Maruti Suzuki cars. So it is also part of the interdependence. The automobile sector is important because many of the multinational companies have put up shop in China, and they also start re-exporting, again on the high seas. China produces nearly 40% of global machine tools, 40% of ships, VLCCs, and others for different countries, and 60% of power generation equipment. Again, these are all exported. India used to import a lot, still imports our equipment, as we require 130,000 megawatts to sustain 8% growth rate this year. We import nearly 40% of that from China. And so you can imagine the kind of maritime imprint that it can have. Overall, the Chinese exports and imports constitute about 40% of the $17 trillion. That's the level of dependence that China has on the maritime domain. And hence, as a result of this, initially China began dual-use facilities like the Hambantota or other areas in other places. So today, 96% of the global shipping containers are produced in China with collaboration with Japan South Korea, European Union, Taiwan, and other maritime faring nations. 80% of the global ship-to-shore cranes, and they also receive about 48% of the world shipbuilding orders a year ago, prior to the COVID-19, when a lot of supply chain disruptions took place and it affected substantially the transportation network, including shipping. China is the second largest fleet, having second largest fleet of commercial shipping vessels. It is home to more shipping ports than any other country, including 7 out of 10 busiest ports in the world, including Shanghai and other ports. China also owns over 100 ports in 63 countries. And in Asia, in South America, in Africa, there is a huge building spree. At the moment, for example, the Mombasa port is some 25 times higher than the previous handling capacity port that existed before. So you can imagine the kind of capacity buildup that they're doing. And many of these are dual use or even completely naval bases, like Gwadar port, like Djibouti port, and Gwadar is also having a lot of construction, and the depth of the port has been increased to about 14 meters. That means large displacement vessels can dock in Gwadar at a future date. Since this is on a 40-year lease, so we do not know what is up the sleeves of China in the future. There are other ports that China has been able to, including Sokna port in Egypt, as a launching pad for the manufactured goods to be exported to the south of Africa from this sub-Saharan African ports. There is also the South America, which has attracted a lot of construction activity in the recent times as a part of the Belt and Road Initiative and others. So major companies in China have been able to cobble up and provide investments in these areas, and something like 132 billion between 2010 to 2018 has been invested. So it has already surpassed the United States as the largest navy, but in bean count rather than in qualitative indicators. Quickly, also in terms of tonnage, there used to be about 1 million tons per year capacity handling production. But today, last year, they produced some 39 million tons of deadweight capacity in civilian sphere. There is a new concept that is coming up increasingly in China. That is we all were familiar with the comprehensive national power. The United Services Institution has done some studies on the CNP. But today, China is moving towards comprehensive maritime power. And there are a few categories here: maritime economy, infrastructure, technology, resources, sustainability, and management of all these coastal regions are one of the main areas of attention in China. I came across these statistics till last decade in Chinese maritime journals on the Chinese maritime power, comprehensive maritime power. So in terms of the comparison that China has with the globe, with developing economies, East Asia, Asia, Southeast Asia, or even G20 countries, there is a marked increase in their parameters, qualitative indicators in the recent times. So much so today they are now the largest trading partner for 128 countries, all put in red in this slide, which indicates that they have acquired a lot of political influence as well, and insisting on many countries to accommodate China's interests. The recent spat between India and Sri Lanka on the Yuan Wang 5 docking at Hambantota is an indicator of how the Chinese trade, investments, and power is influencing many of the states across the globe. And so there is a huge follow through in this regard. And one of the major drivers in China's maritime strategy is in relation to the 1992-93 when they became highly dependent on the imports of energy resources. So the estimates are continuing dependence on the high seas, and over 80% of the 420 million tons that China imported came from the Indian Ocean region, from West Asia, from Africa, specifically Nigeria, Sudan, and Angola. So all of these are passing through the Indian Ocean region, and that has become the main lifeline, as the Chinese call, or as Hu Jintao, the former president, called as the Malacca dilemma, on how to reduce the dependence or vulnerabilities in these areas. So that is one reason why in the last 2 years they have sent about 56 surveillance ships to the Indian Ocean region, and culminating in this Yuan Wang trip recently in August this year. So let me recount some of the maritime drivers of China. One is the sovereignty disputes that China has with East and South China Seas, with several partners like Japan, Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, and also they're claiming the Natuna gas fields in Indonesia. So there is a flexible kind of core interest expansion that China has, and that is really rattling a number of countries on what exactly are the Chinese intentions here. Um, in its white papers and others, China is saying that they wish to effectively secure China's overseas interests. So let me briefly say that China has over 36,000 companies, state-owned or private, like Huawei company, in the 5G telecom sector. So they have 36,000 companies across the globe, and protection of these now have become crucial for the Chinese embassies, for the Chinese Navy, for others. Stocks protection is another, securing fisheries and other marine resources, energy interests, as we just discussed, countering piracy, gun running, and so on, and the two ocean strategy that they have enunciated. So maritime strategy can be looked at historically since 50s as brown water, green water, regional superiority acquisition, and today since 2015, near seas defense, far seas protection. Those are the ones that they have been enlisting, and they have identified Red Sea, Persian Gulf, and northern Indian Ocean region as the lifelines, which means that much of the maritime strategy would be focused in these areas, specifically in terms of securing the SLOCs, sea lanes of communications. That's the idea that they have been putting across. China released over 10 white papers, and this mentions about the trust that the maritime strategy of China has in since 1995. Just to summarize, the current maritime strategy is in relation to uh, protecting, safeguarding China's overseas interests, PLA conducting vessel protection operations, maintaining the security of strategic stocks, and carries out overseas evacuation and maritime protection operations. So that's the larger maritime strategy. I wanted to skip a few of these at the moment due to lack of time. Uh, so defense perimeters are mentioned, the first island chain, second island chain, and the force posture also is reflected here. And the roadmap for the Blue Water Navy by 2040 has also been adopted. And today, increasingly, strategic maritime corridors focus is mentioned in Chinese literature. So PLA modernization as reflected in the white paper, specifically in terms of Navy, is to enhance its capabilities for strategic deterrence, counterattack, maritime maneuvers, integrated joint operations at sea, and comprehensive defense and comprehensive support duties. I will skip the other forces, but it is important we also look at the bean count here. So by 2022, they have 355 naval vessels. Many of these are in the surface ships, and that is in tune with the maritime strategy as well. 420 ships expected in the next 3 years, and by 2030, by the end of the decade, 460 ships, surpassing substantially that of the United States in numbers. So, with the six strategic nuclear submarines and six nuclear attack submarines, China is now expanding also the subsurface forces. But most important here is the large amphibious assault ships. By the way, in the Gulf of Aden operations, they have also used amphibious operations as a subject for these counter Somali piracy operations. Surprisingly, and this indicates that there is a lot of trust in also the amphibious operations. Um, the kind of turnover in many of the shipyards is quite surprising, to say the least. So last year, um, 5052 type of destroyers have been churned out. All the latest stealth design and also the Type 055 in the shipyards. Xi Jinping has been in the forefront in this regard in providing for the expansion of the Chinese Navy and the maritime footprint abroad, specifically in the Indian Ocean region and in the Pacific Ocean region. So even before the IP Indo-Pacific has come about, China has already made substantial inroads in the Indian Ocean region and the Pacific Ocean region. The most important ones, of course, are the Senkaku Islands, where they have had huge tussle with the Japanese, and over 618 transgressions takes place by the Coast Guard of China and the Chinese Air Force, leading to some events on the high seas. South China Sea is another area of attention. The Chinese approach has changed to a dual track policies. The most important thing that I wanted to say here is that they have built a certain quadrilateral fortress in the Paracels, Spratlys, and others. And that is where they are insisting on a territorial sea concept and driving away the Vietnamese in the Haiyan Shrio drilling platforms and others in this larger design for the Belt and Road Initiative, Maritime Silk Road, and so on and so forth. The significant thing here is the Pasture Channel south of Taiwan Straits, south of Taiwan, is the area of attention for the Chinese Navy, in addition to the various other Miyako Strait, Osumi Strait, Tsushima Strait, Sugaru Strait, Tokaro Strait, and they have also claimed Okinawa as their extended claim area in the highly nationalist accounts in China. So that indicates that there is a larger goal that China is pushing through its maritime strategy. So I want you to remember the Pasture Channel and Miyako Strait. If China graduates through these areas, it is easier for them to go forward into the Pacific and then to the Indian Ocean region, either through the Straits of Malacca or through Lombok and Sundas. So that is the thrust area that China is building up, dominating these specific portions. Here are a few details about the Indian Ocean region and the Pacific. And as the SLOCs become the focus, there is also a large Chinese attention in these areas. In Gulf of Aden, where they have now this June introduced a new concept, which is interfering in internal affairs of Ethiopia, Kenya, and other countries.
Professor,
And
can
if
we,
that
can
fructifies,
I request
I
you
will.
to, yeah, thank you.
Yes, sir. So this is one area that the Chinese are being pushing across. So what is the attitude of China towards the Indo-Pacific? Uh, uh, Wang Yi, the foreign minister, suggested that this would be a sea foam. This would be, retracted later on. But we have seen not just the Indo-Pacific that was assembled in Da Nang in November 2017, but there is also the AUKUS and the Quad, which met 4 times so far. So let me conclude by saying that China's maritime footprint has increased substantially, and it is today in a preeminent position in the Indo-Pacific in the economic sphere. And that is how it is trying to also modulate the opinions in many states in the Indo-Pacific. There is a contest here between China, US, Japan, India, and Australia. And in the light of the code of conduct discussion with the ASEAN, ASEAN today has been heavily dependent on China with over $900 billion of trade it has with China. So the code of conduct is expected to be more closer to the Chinese position than compared with the other regional navies' insistence on the freedom of navigation, as China is increasingly pushing the exceptionalism. So, as a policy option, I would suggest that we need to intensify our bilateral relations, maritime relations with Vietnam, Indonesia, where we are building the Sabang port. And I will also suggest provocatively that the Indian Navy's position on primary and secondary areas of attention that need to be tweaked in the light of the Chinese maritime aggression and assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific region. Thank you very much for your attention.
Excuse me, sir. A request if you could unmute your mic, sir.
Thank you very much, Professor. As usual, a riveting talk with time not being on our side, unfortunately. But without further ado, let me turn it over to our next speaker, Mr. Amit Bhandari, Senior Fellow at Gateway House, who has more than 2 decades of experience in public policy as a researcher, an entrepreneur, a financial analyst, and an author. You are probably aware of his wonderful book, India and the Changing Geopolitics of Oil, and it is a subject of a full seminar all by itself. He's also the lead author of the newly released report on Chinese investments in India, which has looked at China's penetration of the Indian ecosystem. He began his career with the Economic Times and tracking the energy sector. It remains one of his core focal areas, and I wanted to emphasize the sheer quality of the work that Amit has been producing, but I will leave it up to you and request Mr. Amit Bhandari to please take the floor and proceed with his presentation. Thank you so much. Amit, you're
Thank you, Admiral Chauhan. Thank you very much. And thanks to the Indian Naval Academy for having me here. And I would also like to request the technical team to please start playing my presentation. So just let me know if it is on and you can see it. Yeah. So my presentation today deals with Chinese investments in India and in South Asia. These are both reports that Gateway House has worked on in the past, and I will be going through the kind of information we found, the key insights that we got from there, and the current areas of study and the current implications of the same. Next slide, please. Yeah. So I will start with the Belt and Road Initiative, which is China's attempt to reshape the world. It was first proposed in 2013 and formalized as a part of the Chinese Communist Party constitution in 2017. If we take it at face value, it is a network of roads, railway lines, and pipelines which will connect China with Central Asia, South Asia, and Europe. And it is an attempt to create a China centric global trading network. There are strategic and economic drivers for BRI as well. And finally, BRI also coincides with increasing Chinese assertiveness on the international stage. Next, please. In the South Asian context, we have seen over the last 7 or 8 years large and significant Chinese investments in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. And all of these countries have ports, roads, railway lines which are being built with Chinese money. There are also very significant defense tie ups. China is the largest military equipment supplier to these countries. And all of this has led to multiple questions with very few answers and very little actual information. How much is China actually investing in India's neighborhood? What is the form in which this investment is coming in? Sectors where the investment is going? Progress on these investments? And finally, of course, what is the current status of these investments given the COVID pandemic and the economic crisis that we are having in the neighborhood? Next, please. So, Gateway House is a Mumbai based think tank. We look at India's foreign policy through an economic prism. And in the last 4 years, we have published two significant reports looking at Chinese investments. The report to the right is Chinese investments in India's neighborhood. It looks at Chinese projects in Pakistan, Maldives, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and Nepal. We had published this work in 2018 and are currently in the process of updating it. The work to the left is Chinese investments in India, which looks at China's investments in India's technology sector and the implications that it may have on data security, financial security, and privacy. Both of these research reports are freely available on the Gateway House website. If you are interested in these subjects, I would encourage you to look at those. Next, please. So, Chinese investments in India's neighborhood was undertaken in 2017. We spent about a year and a half mapping around 400 projects in these 6 countries around India. We had first published this work in 2018, and I will just go through two of the countries that we had analyzed in detail, Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Next, please. Yeah. So, the first thing we tried to do was to map the scope of Chinese investments in these 6 countries. The first number that you see to the left side is the total number of projects that we were able to identify in each single country. As you can see, Pakistan has been the single biggest source focus of Chinese investments, followed by Myanmar and Sri Lanka. The second number is the approximate dollar value of these investments. Now, these numbers were not freely available. Transparency has been a big issue whenever we were trying to look at Chinese investments. In some cases, numbers were available. In many cases, we had to make a guesstimate of the number based on value of similar projects being done elsewhere. And the third column are the key sectors where the money is going in. Now, while Belt and Road is pitched largely as a connectivity initiative, you will see that in the South Asian context, most of the investment, especially in Pakistan and in Myanmar, is really going into the energy sector. So there is clearly a disconnect. While Belt and Road is being pitched as a connectivity initiative, we think that in certain contexts, it is also a way to find markets for China's excess manufacturing capacity in the capital goods sector. Factories which are going to probably become idle because China's own infrastructure build out has been completed. The other part is that these numbers are not actually investments which have happened on the ground. Finally, these are proposals. Some projects have been executed and are operational, some are under construction, some are at the proposal stage. So if we try to make a graph out of it, what we will find is that in Myanmar and in Sri Lanka, most of these investments have actually happened and are paying off positively or otherwise. Pakistan and Maldives are somewhere in the near the peak. They are heading towards the peak, and Nepal and Bangladesh are somewhere at the beginning of the curve. So, if I were to draw a graph, Nepal and Bangladesh are on the ascending part of the graph. Pakistan and Maldives are near the peak, and finally, after the peak, when investments start to decline or when there is a pushback, that is where you have Sri Lanka. And we are witnessing that pushback happening at this point of time. Now, all of these countries are not completely happy with the way Chinese investments have come in or the kind of effects they have had. But there are multiple powerful local constituencies which are in favor of these investments, making pushback very difficult. So one commonality which we have seen, whether it is Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Myanmar, or Pakistan, is that China is the largest military hardware supplier to all of these countries. And of course, in all of these countries, the military has played a very large role in public life. So even before your economic investment started, you already had a big constituency which was there favoring you, and this is what enabled these investments to happen. Secondly, while a lot of us like to complain about corruption in India, one thing to remember is that most of these countries around India have this problem much worse. So projects were undertaken without due diligence, without clearly identifying what the benefits are going to be, what the costs are going to be in the long run, and that eventually also led to the current situation. Next, please. Okay, I will now look at Sri Lanka in detail first. And we have seen the Sri Lankan crisis play out over the next 4 years. And I think the word debt trap diplomacy is one of the contributions that Sri Lanka, the Chinese investments in Sri Lanka have made in the last few years. Now, I think in case of Sri Lanka, there are multiple investments which have happened in ports, in roads, in railway lines, and thermal power. Unfortunately for Sri Lanka, the capacity which has been created has been far in excess of what the country needed. And a very good example of that is the Hambantota port and the nearby airport. The Hambantota port, I think, gets a traffic of around one ship every week. So built at a cost of over $1 billion, uh, this is idling of the highest order. The nearby airport, I don't think, has any scheduled flights at this point of time. Now, port has been built for over $1 billion. It has no traffic, and eventually the debt had to be converted to equity. The port went to China on a 99-year lease. The other part is, and this is something very interesting, one part is the capacity which has been created. The second part is the terms on which these investments have been made. In case of Sri Lanka, the loans which were made to finance these projects were at LIBOR plus 3% interest rate. Typically, when an ADB lends to a sovereign government, lending happens at LIBOR plus 0.25 or 0.5%. In case of Sri Lanka, interest rates were LIBOR plus 3%. So you have a deadly mix. You have overcapacity, as we have seen in case of Hambantota. You have padded costs, which is something that I will go into greater detail in case of Pakistan. And finally, you have a very high interest rate. You combine these three factors and you're looking at a debt trap for the target nation. And in case of Sri Lanka, this playbook has played out completely. As per our estimate, Sri Lanka owes over $8 billion to China, which is about 1/3 of its external debt. Unfortunately, unlike debt which is owed to Japan or ADB or India, the interest rates on this are extremely high. I mentioned in the beginning the problems of transparency and getting proper information, and we face this in case of Sri Lanka. So we found an interesting document on the Sri Lankan Parliament website. This is about 4 years back, detailing all the foreign assistance which has come into the country together with the interest rates. Since our report was published, that document has been removed. It is no longer accessible on Sri Lankan Parliament website. So, I mean, you can see the kind of problems that we face. So what has happened to Sri Lanka since? In the last 12 months, we have seen Sri Lanka defaulting on its foreign debt. Forex reserves are down. The country doesn't have money to pay for its import, either of energy or medicine, food, and other essentials. Inflation is over 20%, and I think it is still going up. And Chinese lending has clearly played a role. And I think this is one of the test cases which China often tries to deny, where that its lending and BRI has played a role in Sri Lanka's crisis. But I think there is an old saying that no rumor is officially confirmed till it has been officially denied. So I think the denials actually speak louder than any allegations. Next, please. In case of Pakistan, it is one of the six. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor will be very well known to this gathering. The CPEC was one of the 6 flagship proposed corridors of BRI. These were $62 billion worth of investments that were planned and proposed. However, most of these investments were not in connectivity, they were in the power sector. As per our estimate, over 50% of CPEC investments are targeted for the power sector, largely coal-fired power plants and hydel power plants. Now, I mentioned the point about padded costs. So we have looked at coal-based power plants in Pakistan. We compared them to similar power projects in India. We found that on a per megawatt basis, the cost of capacity was anywhere from 20 to 50% higher than cost of similar projects in India. That was the first point. The second point that at least our assessment was that the kind of capacity which was being created in Pakistan was far in excess of what that country could realistically absorb for many, many years to come. And the third part was the interest rates on which these loans for CPEC were offered. The loans for Pakistan were on even steeper terms as compared to loans made to Sri Lanka, LIBOR plus 4%, which I think at that time worked out to interest rates of 6.5 to 7% on dollar loans. So you combine the three: overcapacity, padded costs, and a high interest rate. And I think back in 2018 and 19, it was fairly visible that Pakistan is going to face an economic crisis. It had already gone to IMF around 20 times at that point, and we could see the 21st visit shaping up. Now, what have these projects done? At the time when these projects were proposed, we feel the view was that these projects will help prop up a failing ally, which is Pakistan, against a long term rival, which is India. Unfortunately, in case of Pakistan, things didn't quite work out like that. Uh, Pakistan's economic problems, which were already quite evident even 4 or 5 years back, have become much worse, and in part because of the loans made by China for power sector. And finally, the ongoing political crisis that we see in Pakistan also has significant economic roots. There is one significant project I would like to point out in this map. Towards the extreme western edge of Pakistan, you will see a collection of projects which is near the Iran border. That is the Gwadar port. So, as you can see from this map, the Gwadar port is not connected to anything anywhere. It is just a bunch of projects which are bunched together in the middle of nowhere. Now, Gwadar was pitched as a center point of the China Pakistan economic corridor. We tried to look at it in some greater detail. Next, please. So, Gwadar had been pitched as a keystone of the China Pakistan economic corridor, as a second port for Pakistan outside of Karachi, as a local transport hub, and eventually also a way for China to bypass the Malacca Straits. We tried to look at all of these aspects. So, in case of Pakistan, a secondary port for Pakistan, we figured that this cannot work. Gwadar is not connected to the rest of to the main population centers of Pakistan via railway lines, which is the cheapest way to move things on ground. So you bring something to Gwadar, you have to put it on a truck, and then you have to send it to Karachi. So Gwadar doesn't work as a secondary port for Pakistan. Could Gwadar work as a source of oil imports for China? Well, we tried to look. The lightly shaded portion of the map that you see on China are the 4 largest Chinese provinces, which have, I think, less than 5% of China's population. So if oil is brought in via Gwadar, it will have to be piped across the entire length of Pakistan, over a 14,000-foot mountain range, and then over 1,000 kilometers across unpopulated parts of China to reach places where it can be used. Using the most conservative estimates, we feel that it will add at least $8 to $10 for every barrel of oil which is moved this way after a pipeline has been built. A pipeline like this has not been built anywhere in the world up to this point of time. So we do not think that Gwadar can serve as a point of oil import for China in any meaningful way. And similarly, it cannot serve as a conduit for China's exports to the rest of the world. So Gwadar cannot really be a port which will service China in any meaningful way. And finally, can Gwadar become a manufacturing hub, which is one of the things that was being talked about? Raw materials are brought in, processed, and sent out as finished goods. Well, back in 2017, now the Balochistan region of Pakistan is extremely thinly populated, and with a good reason. The place doesn't have any water. Back in 2017, drinking water had to be shipped into Gwadar via naval tankers, because the city had run out. Water in sufficient quantities is one of the key requirements for any industry. If you don't even have that, I don't think industry will work. So given all these factors, we do not think Gwadar has any economic potential in any measurable manner. And the only place where it can eventually, the only way in which it can be eventually used is as a military outpost. And in that sense, it has definitely a lot of potential. And I think the current audience will understand that better than I will. Next, please. So I will not go through the other 4 countries that we have analyzed: Maldives, Nepal, and Myanmar. But I think I will just summarize the key findings. We found that China started in the region with military-to-military tie-ups, which extended to the economic sphere. BRI, in this region at least, was a mix of overcapacity, padded costs, and very high interest rates. We see multiple ports in the region, Hambantota, Kyakpu, and Gwadar, which do not have an economic potential, but which which are financially unviable. So eventually, are these ports going to follow the Djibouti model, where debt is converted into a military presence? And finally, we also see that China is trying to push forward the use of the yuan as an international reserve currency for trade. This has already gotten a push with the sanctions on Russia right now. Next, please.
Amit, we are out of time, so if you could just wind up, please.
Okay, so I think we can just go to the last slide in that case. Sorry, so okay, just a little bit before. One more, please. The one before. I'm so sorry. Yeah. So, what are the key implications for India of BRI in South Asian region? The first is there is a creation of long-term economic and political dependence on China for the smaller countries of the region. Second part is we see these countries getting drawn into the Chinese financial architecture. China wants the yuan to play the same role as dollar in international commerce. Getting these countries in will be a big help in that area. The third part is that because of Chinese lending, these countries have been pushed into economic and subsequently political crisis. And these unstable neighbors pose a threat to India's economic and physical security. India expects to be the fastest growing large economy in the world this year and the next year, but can we continue to grow if we are in a chaotic neighborhood? There is the potential use of ports as military installations. This is something which will have to be analyzed. And finally, there are certain risks which are which are there inside of China. The economy is slowing down. The real estate sector, which is a major sector, is in a crisis. Multiple companies have defaulted. The tech sector has been subject to a very harsh crackdown. And we feel that China is overstating its population, which has actually been declining for a number of years. So a declining country is a dangerous country. And that, I think, is one of the key risks that also needs to be understood better. Other than that, my other report, which I don't have the time to discuss, will be available on Gateway House website. You can write to us and you can pursue the report over there. We'll be happy to take any queries. Thank you, Admiral Chauhan. Over from my side.
Thank you so much, and my apologies for rushing you through. Once again, each of these presentations are rich, offer rich pickings, and towards that end, let me commence with the Q&A section and ask the audience to participate and ask questions. Please start now, and our panelists would be happy to address as many as they can.
Ladies and gentlemen, the house is now open for questions.
Good morning to the esteemed panel members. I am Achievement Sohit Rakshit, and my question is to Mr. Srikanth Kondapalli. Sir, we are seeing a rise in Chinese military exercises which are being conducted with our traditional partners like Iran and Russia. So, what should be the steps taken by the Indian government or the Navy in order to enhance and strengthen our partnership with such nations?
Perhaps we could do one or two questions before, rather than having each question answered separately, and take a couple of questions and then see how we go from there.
Good morning, sir. In June this year, President of the United States, Joe Biden, along with G7, had
Just 1 second, could I request Professor Kondapalli and Mr. Bandari to please mute your mics until the questions are done. Thank you. Please go ahead.
yes. In June this year, President of the United States, Joe Biden, along with G7 allies, unveiled a program for global infrastructure and investment to counter BRI, wherein G7 will be mobilizing about $600 billion by 2017 to deliver infrastructure and investment to middle income countries. Indonesia has also adopted to global maritime fulcrum as a hedge against BRI. So my question is, do you think that initiatives by nations having their own problems will be able to deter or displace China as in the case of BRI? And what are then the opportunities for India?
I'm sorry, whom did the question get addressed to?
So it was addressed to the panel. Anyone would be
Oh,
interested.
okay. Right. So perhaps we will take one last question.
Good morning, sir. Sir, in spite of facing international backlash, China decided to go ahead and dock its spy vessel in Sri Lanka. In such a scenario, what should be India's coordinated response?
Okay, thank you very much. Those are three sharp questions, and the first one goes to Professor Kondapalli, and perhaps Amit, you can take the second, and we will go back to Professor Kondapalli for the third. Otherwise, I would like to intervene in that one. Yeah. So just unmute yourself before you speak, sirs.
Thank you very much for those questions on China, Iran, Russia, and on the Yuan Wang. I request Admiral Chauhan to answer the Yuan Wang related issue. On the first one on China, Iran, Russia. So let's see the 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago, China had signed an agreement with Iran for over $250 billion agreement. China's interests in Iran are basically in terms of the oil. They used to import about 24% before, and under the American pressure, as they also exerted on India, under the American pressure, the Chinese reduced this to about 11%. And of course, today they are increasing in the light of the energy prices being up over $100 per barrel. The other is Iran has joined SCO.
I think we have a slight connectivity problem with Professor Kondapalli. So in the interest of time, I'm not sure whether Srikant, you can hear me, but in the interest of time, maybe we can ask Mr. Bhandari to answer his question and then come back to you as soon as your connectivity is restored. Amit, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. Now, one of the reasons why BRI moved, why BRI was so successful in the initial years was that there were simply no other options available. Poor and middle income countries do need infrastructure. That infrastructure will often not be financially viable. But if the financing is not being done by multilateral bodies like the World Bank and the ADB, the countries will go to whichever funder is willing to supply money and resources and on whatever terms that are available. It's a bit like the problem with money lenders. If you're not going to get loan from a bank at a reasonable rate, you will go to money lender who will then put in his or her own conditions which can be extortionate. So having in options for financing of infrastructure at least creates other avenues where countries with viable projects can go to and get funding for their legitimate needs with and in these cases proper procedures and safeguards can be followed so that the countries don't end up getting into a debt trap. And I think the initiatives which were announced and which the question are also listed out partly are there because of the fact that China came up with BRI. An option had to be created and now it is there.
Thank you very much. With regard to the Yuan Wang class, I just wanted to emphasize that the Yuan Wang class is a satellite and space tracking vessel. It does not represent a strength of China. It represents a huge vulnerability. China invests in this not because it wanted to, but because it doesn't have physical ground available to be able to track space-based assets, not only satellites, but also intercontinental ballistic missiles. So our own space-based assets are also capable of being tracked, but for that, the vessel need not have come into Hambantota or anything as proximate to us as that. And therefore, what ought we to do? I rather think that we ought to be tracking these vessels and we ought to be marking them. As you know, the Yuan Wang class has one vessel on either coast of the African continent. One on the Atlantic side and one on the Indian Ocean side, affecting pretty much zero PIM. And similarly, they have one vessel available in the South Pacific, because you need these vessels, you need these satellite arrays to be able to, as I said, offer continual, if not continuous, tracking and tracking corrections, and therefore marking would send an extremely powerful signal across. But for that, we need to leverage exercises such as the IPSA-MAR and ensure that they don't get shifted geographically, but remain off the coast of South Africa. There are some questions which are online, and I will. That means from the audience which is watching this on YouTube, and there is one of how is the OROB, that is the Belt and Road, really, One Road, One Belt initiative of China. And is there any way that we can again restore the trust which has been lost in the past decade? This is obviously coming from the Chinese perspective. And perhaps, Amit, you would like to give it a shot, and then we'll call it a day.
I will take it from the Indian perspective, if that is okay. That
No, he wants to know from the Chinese perspective, what should the Chinese be doing to restore the trust that they have managed to lose in the last few years in India, the trust by India?
I think that is not something which can be handled in a short Q&A. I think in case of the region, however, one of the ways for China or anybody to proceed would be simply to stop the kind of unilateral lending, irresponsible lending, which puts up the home country or the target country into an unsustainable debt trap. Will not work. It will cause long-term unhappiness. Ideally, if China does want to finance infrastructure, it should happen under the umbrella of a multilateral agency such as the World Bank or the ADB. World Bank projects are a pain to get through. The World Bank imposes multiple conditions, ensuring transparency, ensuring that no bribes are paid, ensuring that corruption doesn't happen. These things are very difficult to get through. However, the projects which go through via World Bank rarely end up in the same trouble, and you don't get a Hambantota port happening under the aegis of the World Bank. So I would say that if infrastructure has to be funded, let it happen in a transparent manner under multilateral agencies. That will definitely go some way in restoring the trust which has been lost.
Thank you, Amit. I'd just like to add one thing before we break for tea, and that is that, if you want to build trust in India, and if you are China, there are two things that you must recognize. One is that India is a single geopolitical entity. There are no two Indias, one of them operating in the Trans-Himalayan border and another one operating at sea. And therefore, if you violate Indian territory in one area, you violate Indian territory everywhere. That is point number one. And if you want to build trust in India, you must start learning China must start learning and practicing how to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of countries around it, which is something that it professes that it holds so dear to its own heart. My second and last point is that when we talk about CPEC, I would request every member of this audience, and Amit, I think perhaps you would like to take this under advisement yourself. We should not use this word CPEC. This is CPOC. This is the China-Pakistan occupied Kashmir Economic Corridor. Every time we say CPEC, we legitimize in our minds the illegal occupation of Kashmir by Pakistan. And whether the United States and the plethora of articles that appear on the websites of the world on the internet keep saying CPEC is one thing, I don't think India ought to be doing exactly the same thing. But that is a matter for some other discussion and some other point in time. Right now, I'm sorry, I've been a poor timekeeper. I also have one apology to make to Professor Kondapalli, who we unfortunately could not get back on line. So I will now, with the permission of the Commandant, request the organizers to take over and have a tea break for whatever time is available to them before we reassemble. Thank you so much.
Sir, we will resume at 11:05.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, please?
Thank you, sir. We will resume at 11:05. It's okay, if it's okay, sir.
11:05 sounds great to me. Thank you so very much.
Sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are halfway through session 3, and it is now time to take a tea break. We will see you at precisely 11:05 hours. Excuse me, Sid. Sir, I request you to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. It is with the singular honor and a sense of particular pride that I introduce the next speaker, none other than my friend, my colleague, and in many cases, my mentor, guide, and savior, uh, Admiral G. Ashok Kumar, who is currently our National Maritime Security Coordinator. In his distinguished naval career of almost 4 decades, he has held a number of challenging staff and command assignments. In many cases, he has been sent specifically to clean up the mess that I create in those particular appointments. And he has done so with both aplomb and efficiency. So, having completed his own specialization as a navigation and direction officer way back in 1989, he has done navigating tenures in a number of frontline combatants of the Indian Navy's surface fleet, Vyas, Nilgiri, the Ranveer, and of course the Vikrant. And then he's commanded the Kulish, the Ranveer, and has also been, as I said earlier, the executive officer on board the Brahmaputra, which I consider was a success in every respect, largely due to his talent. Among his short tenures, the important ones include hot Navy. The advantage of being hot Navy is that it's really a demotion because everybody else seems to be shit hot and you're just hot. But even then, he was simply marvelous at the job. He's been our defense advisor at the High Commission of India in Singapore, where he has even today a fan following that would make many of our movie stars somewhat envious. On promotion to flag rank, he's been Flag Officer Sea Training. He's been the Chief of Staff of the Southern Naval Command. He's been Flag Officer Maharashtra and Gujarat area. And as a Vice Admiral, he's of course been the Commandant of the National Defence Academy in Pune. He's been the Deputy Chief of the Naval Staff and followed that in back-to-back assignments as the Vice Chief, where he would remained and led the Indian Navy just prior to his superannuation from service on the 31st of July of 2021. So I could go on about Admiral Ashok Kumar's many accolades and achievements, but in the interest of time, I will hand over the proceedings to him to talk to us today upon the emerging challenges of non-traditional threats, particularly terrorism from the sea and their implications on India. So without further ado and with a great sense of keen anticipation, let me hand over to you, Ashok. It's all yours.
Admiral Pradeep Chauhan, the moderator, and my co-panelists, Commandant INA and the cadets of INA and all those who are listening to it through the YouTube and Facebook. A very good morning to each one of you. It's indeed my proud privilege to be part of the Dilli series of seminars. Last year too, I was a part of it, and it's indeed a proud privilege. Coming to the topic, emerging challenges of non-traditional threats, including terrorism from sea and implications for India. I must at the outset tell you that in the afternoon, the panel discussion moderated by Admiral Arun Prakash has the topic as key enablers of India as regional maritime power to ensure stability, security, peaceful coexistence and development in the Indian Ocean region. So what I intend doing is that because this has implications for India, I will kind of look inward so that in the afternoon panel, in which also I am a part, I will try and look outward. To start with, as you all must have been told a number of times, there is this huge maritime dependence that India has. With a peninsula jutting out into the Indian Ocean, with a huge coastline, which is quite often quoted as 7,500 and odd, that's quickly going to change because with the advance in technology, the new measurements actually indicate, in fact, we quite doubt as to where the 7,500 came from. It happens to be over 11,000 kilometers. So that will very soon be promulgated with a huge number of offline islands that we have, including the Andamans and Nicobars to our east and Lakshadweep to our west, with 2.1 million square kilometers EEZ, 12 major ports and more than 200 non-major ports. The number just keeps increasing with time, and those are truly the economic gateways of our country, with more than 3 lakh fishing boats that go out of our country for fishing. 90% of our petroleum products being either imported from abroad or being produced offshore, which takes the sea route to come to the country. With over 90% of our trade being maritime in nature, we are truly a maritime nation. And I must tell you, we are totally dependent on maritime security for nation's well-being and the nation's prosperity. There are a number of characters, however, that make it very convenient for non-traditional threats to thrive. The first one is that, as you all are aware, the territorial seas extends to 12 nautical miles from the coast, and beyond that is international waters. So where freedom of navigation is given. Now, while nations enjoy certain rights as per UNCLOS within the seas abetting our coastline and the baseline, these rights and the jurisdictional value kind of tends to decrease with the distance from the coast. And as I mentioned, the concept of global commons makes it legal for anybody to be present anywhere at any time. And this is only complicated by inadequate international conventions and domestic laws, which make it very difficult for somebody to be tried, even if he's caught. Then, of course, traditional threats do not have, a uniformed and recognizable adversary. Quite often you can't even recognize the adversary. He just merges with the crowd and makes it even more difficult. Now, types of threats that are out there, piracy, you all are aware as to how Gulf of Aden has been filled with Somali pirates. We have had incidents of piracy in the Malacca Straits, which kind of goes up and down. We have the Gulf of Guinea, which is now the new hotspot for piracy on the west coast of Africa. And the Indian Navy, as you're aware, has been deploying there since October 2008. Although piracy within our MZI, the focal point or the lead agency is actually the Coast Guard. We have gun running and arms smuggling, drug peddling. You must be reading cases of catches that happen almost on a daily basis these days of drug peddling incidents, and they tend to actually take newer and fresher approaches. Now, this is all requiring constabulary response or a semi-military kind of a response. However, there are also benign response requirements when it comes to HADR, the increasing numbers and the increasing strength of cyclones that happens quite routinely these days because of the climate change that we're face to face with. Maritime terrorism is there in the topic as well. 2611, in fact, proved to be a watershed for us. And that brought in a fresh focus on coastal security, and in addition to the overall maritime security and offshore security that we always dealt with. Now, as I mentioned, let me look inward now to the country, and let us look at policy issues, assets and trading issues while dealing with all of this. Now, if you went back in time, it was 1976 that the Maritime Zones of India Act, or what's called the MZI Act, came into being. This was actually triggered by two developments. One was that in 1974, oil was discovered in our offshore areas, the Mumbai High. And the UNCLOS discussion, the conference was already on for UNCLOS 3, and that led to coming in of the United Nations Conventions on the Loss of the Seas in 1982. So the MZI preceded the UNCLOS by about 6 years, and so that also created a bit of problem because some of the conventions or some of the articles that were included in the UNCLOS did not find mention in MZI. For example, the strait baselines and what is called the internal waters, which is between the coastline and the strait baseline, is actually missing from the MZI Act, and therefore that creates a bit of a problem, which I'll come to slightly later. Creation of Coast Guard was the next step. Both the UNCLOS and the oil fine necessitated the nation to create a force which will just look at law enforcement functions in the maritime zones of India. So Coast Guard came into being, and the Coast Guard Act was passed in 1978. And of course, some of the responsibilities that the Coast Guard was actually mandated to take over was actually handed over to the Indian Navy, saying that till such time the Coast Guard is ready to take on these responsibilities, the Navy will continue. One of them is the offshore security, all the oil fields. Much later, Kargil happened, as you're aware, and there was a Kargil committee which was formed, and Dr. Subramaniam headed the committee. These recommendations, which looked only at the land border to the northwest, where Kargil actually happened, was handed over to a group of ministers, and the group of ministers looked at the security architecture for the entire nation. And that came out with a number of recommendations. One was to create coastal police, quite like the model that was already in existence in Andaman and Nicobar since 1956 or 57, I think. And that also recommended what is now existing: coastal surveillance radar network, the national AIS chain, and many of these. And this led to the birth of the coastal security scheme, and the CSS phase 1 came into being. And of course, one other recommendation was creation of what is then called the National Maritime Advisor, which recognized the fact that there were a number of ministries and agencies which are dealing with the maritime domain, and there needed to be an apex level coordination. And now, of course, the NMSE was appointed in February this year. Then 2611 happened in 2008. And when 2611 happened, there were two CCS notes which were issued, one to the Navy, one to the Coast Guard. And these responsibilities somewhere in between these two CCS notes got diffused. So while the Navy was made overall responsible for maritime security, which included offshore and coastal security, the Coast Guard was made responsible for coastal security in territorial waters. So suddenly in territorial waters, who is responsible? Is it solely the Coast Guard? Is it between the Navy and the Coast Guard? Was a bit of a confusion. Then, of course, there were a number of other measures which were introduced. One of them was the PANS, which is the pre-arrival notification security, which every merchant vessel prior to entering any of the Indian ports had to make a pre-arrival notification security call some 96 hours earlier. Then there was also a fitment of AIS in vessels which were more than 20 meters. Of course, that left a void less than 20 meters, which is now attempted to be overcome by a transponder, which will also be a welfare transponder, not just a position indication transponder. At that time came into existence the NCQBI network as well, with IMAC, or the Information Management and Analysis Center at Gurugram, which the Navy runs. And you'll all be happy to know that about a couple of weeks back, the National Maritime Domain Awareness Project has been approved by the CCS, Cabinet Committee on Security, and the NCQBI network will be upgraded to NMDA with whatever inputs which are otherwise missing, with all of them coming into the NMDA. We, of course, have port security. The Indian Ports Act 1908 is the reference, and which is now more than 120 years almost. And so there is a new Indian Ports Act 22, which is kind of making its way up for approval. We also have the fishing. If you were to look at port security, I must also mention to you that the seaward security is actually handled by the CISF for major ports. The minor ports being the responsibility of respective states, it is left to the states. And so it's either a private security or the Strait Industrial Security Force which look at security, which can be a bit of a gap. Fishing, as I mentioned, 3 lakh fishing boats that go out. There is a draft Marine Fisheries Bill 2022, which is on its way up. As per the Constitution, fishing within territorial waters is a state subject. Beyond that is actually the central subject. So the states actually come out with what's called the State Marine Fisheries Regulation Acts, which is supposed to control fisheries. One concern happens to be the fishing villages, the fishing harbors, and the fish landing centers, where keeping track of who's coming in, who's going out can always be a challenge, just because of this vast numbers. I mentioned about the strait baselines and internal waters. There is a bit of a problem in the sense that now suddenly in 2009, when India, as per the UNCLOS Convention, accepted or drew strait baselines, what happened was places like, say, the Gulf of Kutch, instead of the baseline going along the coast inside the Gulf of Kutch. Now the mouth of Gulf of Kutch is a straight baseline. Similar is the case with Gulf of Kambat. Similar is the case with a number of these bays which was allowed by the UNCLOS. The offlying islands in the Lakshadweep and Minicoy have been kind of enclosed with a straight baseline. So now suddenly the territorial waters goes outward from the baseline and not from the coastline. So that gap between the coastline and the baseline, where there is innocent passage which is allowed, can prove to be a bit of a challenge. There is a BPR&D, Bureau of Police Research and Development, standard operating procedure for coastal security police, which requires them to go for an operation jurisdiction of 5 nautical miles from the baseline. Suddenly now the baseline for them is about 90 miles away, if you take the case of Gulf of Kutch, for example, or Lakshadweep and Minicoy, for example. So that is a challenge which needs to be addressed. In all this, in 2019, the Coast Guard was also legally empowered, and so that is now, and the Navy is not. So a lot of the legal or the law enforcement functions, the Coast Guard is in a better position to handle. Now, in all this, what needs to be addressed for us to be better prepared? There is a requirement of multi-agency coordination, because quite often it should not happen that one ministry or one department ends up issuing an order which can be at cross purposes or counterproductive to what somebody else is doing. So that is why this creation of NMSC and the Maritime Security Division under him have a huge role to play. We also have the charter to plug the gaps, overcome overlaps in responsibilities, and diffuse jurisdictions which is existing because of these various orders. This is also being addressed. Now, we should also ensure, now, if you were to just move it from say our EEZ boundary towards the coast, you find the number of security forces, forget about the concentration of maritime domain awareness, even the number of security forces is too high. You'll find the Indian Navy, then you come to the Indian Coast Guard, you got offshore security between both. Then when you come further close, you got in the territorial waters, you got the Coastal Security Police. For major ports, you got the CISF. For minor ports, you got the private security or the state industrial security force. Then you got the SPNs, or the single point moorings, which within port limits is the port responsibility. So therefore, CISF if it is major port, private if it is minor. So it's a bit of a mess. So we need to ensure that forces created for a specific purpose do their job. So what I call right force for the right job, I think should be the way ahead. This is one thing that needs urgent addressing. And a multi-agency SOP. There are standard operating procedures available for a number of these non-traditional threat contingencies, including HADR contingency. But we need to give it a multi-agency orientation. It can't be a Navy-specific or a Coast Guard-specific SOP, while a number of other players are also there. A couple of points. One is asset induction. You'll always find there is a conflict between combat requirements and constabulary requirements. Yet, the Navy or any other force cannot afford to have two different sets of assets catering for each of these requirements. So quite often you will hear a complaint that these effects of deployment for constabulary having an adverse impact on our combat preparedness, which through procedures and mechanisms we need to address that and overcome these kinds of mental blocks. Training, there needs to be a clear understanding of legal provisions. Quite often you find a number of people who deploy to sea are unaware of the UNCLOS provision which exists, or what are the legal implications of, say, catching a drug peddler or a piratical act which happens. So there needs to be a clear understanding. So our training needs to cater for it, whether it is during the transition cycle and work up by the FOST organization or during the COMSATs, OLSATs that the commands undertake. These kinds of things need to be understood, and the operational SOPs, the multi-agency operational SOPs, what is the role that, say, the Navy plays, the Coast Guard plays, needs to be catered in their respective trainings. I think I've got another 4 minutes, so I'll start winding up. One point that I want to make here is that the final point is this, that every non-traditional threat in the maritime domain is transnational in nature. And therefore, the approach has got to be multinational in character. That's why I mentioned about the Gulf of Aden, where the Navy has been deployed since 2009. And it is not we just alone deploy there. We constantly interact with others as well. We are members of the RECAP. In fact, as I mentioned, the Coast Guard is the lead agency for piracy within the MZI. And so the regional cooperation against armed piracy thing which came up in 2007, I recall. And it was a Japanese initiative with the ISC, or the Information Sharing Center for RECAP, located at Singapore. Indian Coast Guard is a member. In fact, there is an Indian Coast Guard officer who is on secondment at the ISC Singapore. And there are a number of other things that we do, whether it is off Sankalp in the Gulf of Aden, whether it is the Corpats and the EZ patrols that we do for others because they don't have the capacity, and multilateral constructs like the IONS and the IORA, BIMSTEC, CSC, IPOI. Each of these have a vertical or solely towards addressing maritime security threats, including non-traditional threats. My last point, I think two of the biggest initiatives that the Indian Navy has taken is one, the mission-based deployments, which makes us, gets us to a better position to react to any threat that comes up, and actually has helped our stature as the first responder and net security provider in the Indian Ocean region. And the second is the launch of IFC IOR. As you're aware, there are foreign naval liaison officers too there. That helps develop a comprehensive maritime domain awareness picture, which is the first step towards addressing any of the non-security threats. In conclusion, let me tell you that the non-traditional maritime security threats are here to stay and constantly evolving. And with our near total dependence on maritime domain for our national prosperity, effectively dealing with non-traditional threats is an inescapable necessity for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Admiral. And as usual, you are succinct, and thank you very much for staying within the time and yet providing us with such an elaborate overview as well as an adequate amount of detail. Our final speaker for this session is, he needs no introduction, at least to the audience here, but bearing in mind that there are a number of people who are probably on watching this on YouTube, perhaps I had in fact better quickly introduce Vice Admiral Puneet Kumar Behel, the Commandant of the Indian Naval Academy at Erimala, under whose aegis we are indeed having this edition of the Dilli series of seminars. Admiral Behel was commissioned in July 1984, and he is an alumnus of the National Defence Academy at Khadakwasla, the Defence Services Staff College in Wellington, and of course the Naval High Command course in the College of Naval Warfare. He is an experienced pilot and has many months and years of experience in multi-role operations. In particular, he's flown 6 different types of aircraft. He has had tenures in all our major air stations. He's been a singularly effective flag officer. Upon his appointment as flag officer, he's held the appointments of ACIDS in HQIDS in New Delhi. He's been the flag officer commanding of the Goa Naval Area and flag officer naval aviation at Goa. He's been flag officer commanding Maharashtra Naval Area. He's been deeply involved in the shaping of our officer corps, not only in his current assignment, but also as Chief Staff Officer Training in Headquarters Southern Naval Command, and as the Chief Instructor of the Navy for the Naval Wing at DSSC Wellington. The Admiral is well known to me and a gentleman whom I am full of admiration for. And indeed, it is a singular honor and a pleasure for me to be able to request him to take the floor and talk to us about the influence of technological developments on sea power and shaping future naval strategy. However, at the cost of perhaps a minute more of your time, I wanted to emphasize that however important, and it is hugely important to grasp, to internalize, and to imbibe technology, it is a mistake to think that technology equals victory. Technology doesn't equal victory, and you don't have to go too far. abroad to make that out. If you look at India's own experience in 1965, when the Indian Air Force was operating NACs and the Pakistanis were operating Sabre jets, even though the Sabre jet was widely known to be the best dogfighter on the planet at that point in time, it was the NAT and the NAT fighters and the Indian Air Force and the country of India that prevailed. Similarly, in 1971, while Pakistan's army was operating Patton tanks, we were still struggling with Centurions and a couple of T-71s, and yet the country with the inferior technology emerged winner. Does that mean that therefore technology is not important and that technology could be given the go by? Of course not. It means that technology is crucial, but it does not automatically equal to combat victory. For that, you need human talent, and therefore, I think that Admiral Behel is ideally placed, commanding both domains with equal felicity, to enlighten us on the whole subject of technology. Admiral, it's over to you.
Thank you, sir. A nation's ability to fight a modern war is as good as its technical and technological ability. Admiral Pradeep Chauhan, the Chair, Admiral Ashok Kumar, National Maritime Security Coordinator, ladies and gentlemen, very good morning to you. I start my talk with this relevant quote by Sir Frank Whittle, the British engineer from Royal Air Force, who is credited with inventing the jet engine. Over the years, we have seen how defense technology has transformed warfare and indeed most of everything that we do in life. Breakthrough defense technologies conceived over the years have had tangible spin-offs for use even outside defense. Little wonder then that The Economist has called DARPA of US as the agency that has shaped the modern world. Today, cutting-edge off-the-shelf technologies are driving the change in the way we do business and indeed the way we fight. We simply need to align and welcome this change. Here the profound words of Charles Darwin come to mind, and I quote, "It is not the strongest species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but those that are most responsive to change," unquote. Likewise, Sir Winston Churchill had famously said, "To improve is to change, to be perfect is to change often," unquote. Technology, ladies and gentlemen, is a key enabler for all types of warfare across domains. Maritime doctrine and strategy, particularly at the operational and tactical levels of war fighting, must also adapt to factor in this paradigm shift. Doctrines have to remain flexible to changes in the operating environment due to interplay of new technologies and political direction. Technology has changed warfare more than any other variable factor and has driven development of advanced weapons, sensors, and systems that have revolutionized military affairs. Van Creveld, in his work on technology and war, has stated that the greatest victory that have been won do not depend upon simple superiority of technology, and this was the point Admiral Chauhan also made, but rather on meshing one side's advantage with the other's weaknesses, so as to produce the greatest gap between the two. Therefore, we need to keep in mind that technology, though a key enabler, will not be the proverbial magic wand and the panacea for all problems in war. Primitive tribal wars gave way to the second wave of warfare with the advent of Industrial Revolution. Here, mass production of weapons was undertaken in tandem with massing of huge forces in the naval and land warfare domains. Progressive development of ironclad ships, machine guns, aircraft, tanks, aircraft carriers, radars, and nuclear weapons are but a few examples of technological innovations that had revolutionized the conduct of warfare in the industrial age. Military organization, doctrine, and strategy were also shaped to take into account these developments. Conceptually, however, primacy continued to be accorded to heavy attrition to wear down the war-waging potential and the will of the enemy. This largely held true during the World Wars and the early part of the Cold War. Development of nuclear weapons added to the destruction capability, as was demonstrated in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki towards the end of World War II. History bears testimony to the fact that adaptable nature of maritime nations and their progressive culture has kept naval warfare at the hub of tactical and technical modernization. Given this backdrop, over the next 25 minutes or so, with the indulgence, very kind indulgence of the chair, I intend to describe the progressive development and absorption of naval technology for the exercise of sea power. I plan to cover my talk under the heads as shown on the screen. Naval ship technology in the early 20th century and during World War I was dominated by the British dreadnought battleship with two revolutionary features, that is the big gun armament and the steam turbine propulsion. These ships became the symbols of national pride, with all seafaring nations aspiring to acquire them. The introduction of the gyroscope and the centralized fire control led to dramatic improvements in gunnery, including the ranges of the guns. Theoretically, inexpensive torpedo boats deployed in large numbers could attack and overwhelm a dreadnought force. This led to the introduction of the torpedo boat destroyers, or simply destroyers, to keep the torpedo boats at bay. Germans led in the submarine technologies during World War I with mass deployment of U-boats. Limited range and speed of the earlier versions of these boats placed tactical limitations on their use against fleet ships. Submarines were more productive, therefore, in attacking poorly defended merchant ships. They were used more effectively against trade warfare of the adversary, and they attacked merchant ships and also enforced naval blockades. U-boats also struck indirectly with perhaps a more insidious strategy through laying of mines. U-boats themselves were also not invincible and had to surface regularly when some were spotted by the sonar and destroyed. The naval ships during World War I were commonly equipped with the radio telegraph. The sonar was still in its infancy. Aviation was primarily focused on reconnaissance, with the aircraft carrier being developed over the course of the war and the bomber aircraft capable of lifting only relative light loads. Naval mines were also developed, and defensive mining along course restricted operations by ships and submarines of the adversary. Coming to World War II, one of the most important and feared changes brought out by technology was the application of maritime power through the aircraft carriers. The lethality of mobile carrier battle groups manifested in all the three dimensions. Likewise, the development of active sonar, ahead-thrown ASW weapons, and better torpedoes improved the anti-submarine capability of ships. Stealth was improved in submarines by the Germans through addition of snorkel in the later stages of the war. Induction of radars and the development of variable time fuses improved the lethality of anti-aircraft guns against aircraft. Likewise, the development of amphibious vehicles enhanced the success rate of amphibious operations in World War II. Atomic weapons, however, were the major technological developments of the war. These continue to be relevant in the application of sea power today, particularly so in SSBNs as the sea-based leg of the nuclear triad. Radio fitment in the German tanks enhanced the efficiency of the blitzkrieg tactics in the early stages of the war. This led to proliferation of radio communication and development of combat information centers on ships and aircraft to improve command and control capability. As a corollary, cryptography, cryptoanalysis, and decoding saw Herculean efforts being put in by the adversary. In fact, meticulous work of code breakers based at Britain's Bletchley Park played a crucial role in shortening World War II by almost 2 years, thereby accelerating the final defeat of Germany. Looking at some of the post-World War II developments, the development of V2, the world's first large-scale liquid propellant rocket between 1936 and 1942 in Germany is regarded as a revolutionary breakthrough in rocket, missile, and space technology. This technology was developed further after World War II by the United States when it led to the design of the rocket that took astronauts to the moon. US started developing cruise missiles as a tactical weapon soon after World War II and the ballistic missiles in the late 1950s as a strategic weapon carrier. By the late 1960s, the American Harpoon, the British Sea Eagle, French Exocet, Soviet Styx were in production and operational use in many countries. The Falklands War renewed the interest of navies in cruise missiles, and the last decade of the 20th century was known for tomahawks in Gulf Wars, development of Russian supersonic missiles, leading to our very own BrahMos, the development of the anti-missile defense, and even the superior ballistic missile defense systems. The improvement and further development of nuclear weapons as strategic systems led to reshaping of doctrines and strategies to factor in their immensely destructive potential. Concepts of deployment, nuclear triad, mutually assured destruction, no first use, and related aspects were factored into the doctrines to avoid strategic uncertainty with a larger view to prevent their use in wars. Ladies and gentlemen, the Indian nuclear doctrine, as you're aware, was adopted in January 2003. Nuclear propulsion for submarines was developed in US and the erstwhile Soviet Union after World War II. UK, France, and China also followed suit. However, these are large and very expensive platforms and are not suitable for operating in shallow coastal waters. Diesel-electric conventional submarines, therefore, are continuing to evolve with technologies like air-independent propulsion, which enhance their endurance underwater. Ladies and gentlemen, if we have to look at future naval weapons and equipment shaping maritime strategy, the Gulf War is widely believed to be the transition point for development of a new kind of warfare, which is described by Toffler as the third wave form, which led on to the information age warfare. This was characterized by minimizing collateral damage through precision weapons, increased tempo of operations, improved surveillance, real-time information, and faster target acquisition and destruction. The doctrinal focus changed to destruction of the command and control nerve centers of the enemy. Coming to network-centric operations, maritime domain awareness and battlefield transparency are imperative to remove the fog of war and are enduring doctrinal requirements for the present-day operations. The availability of state-of-art satellites, encryption communication systems, computers, and data fusion are the key enablers for net-centric operations. This has shortened the OODA loop and improved cooperative engagement capability. Progressive incorporation of artificial intelligence is facilitating exponential enhancement of net-centric capabilities. Improvement of C4I 2SR capabilities and long-range precision weapons has facilitated move towards more distributed and lethal operations. Distributed operations increase the surveillance effort of the adversary, complicates his targeting problems, and also dilutes his density of attack. Conceptually, it also provides us with wider coverage against the adversary in our areas of interest, and this was also brought out by Admiral Ashok Kumar as he covered his talk, where he talked about mission-based deployments in wide areas. In fact, the US Navy looks at countering the anti-access and area denial, that is the A2AD strategy of the adversaries, by deployment of surface action groups for distributed operations. Unmanned systems, artificial intelligence, big data, cyber and space warfare, quantum computing, directed energy weapons, hypersonic weapons have added to the range and scale of capabilities and complexities. Cyber and space domain have their own set of vulnerabilities and limitations that we will need to factor in as our dependence in these technologies increases. A brief doctrinal overview on these concepts is therefore considered important. China, US, NATO, and India and some other nations are undertaking extensive work in quantum computing R&D. US Navy CNO's 2021 navigation plan has stressed on the requirement of the Navy to harness quantum computing to ensure that its timeless roles of sea control and power projection are not compromised. Two critical areas that are being accorded undivided attention by navies include quantum cryptography and quantum sensing. It is understood that China has already developed the world's first integrated quantum communication network and has also launched a quantum satellite. These aim to make Chinese communications totally secure. China will, however, be able to exploit the adversary's naval communications through its quantum code-breaking technology. Quantum sensing is another technology that will provide new capabilities for stealthy navigation and intelligence collection on adversary ships and units through environment sensitivity matching. Quantum navigation also offers solutions to the naval dilemma of over-dependence on GPS for navigation at sea. Coming to multi-domain operations, wars at the lower end of the spectrum will continue to be fought as a part of no war, no peace situation alongside the continuum of contestation and the omnipresent challenges of the cyber warfare. Many exercises and war games in the Western world are centered on the operational scenarios of terrorists supported by foreign powers, a fact that is not alien in our neighborhood. The concept of cross-domain or MDO aims at combining air, land, sea, space, and cyber capabilities in a seamless manner to achieve military advantage. This also includes the aspect of utilizing specific service weapons to gain advantage over the adversary by using them in other domains with minor adaptations. The key for cross-domain operations to succeed will be an enabling and secure network to exchange information across domains. Apart from harnessing MDO capabilities at the national levels, NATO is also looking at MDO across allied nations so that, and this is important, they can operate seamlessly together for mutual defense across 30 members. Advanced AI-enabled computing technologies today allow autonomous and intelligent combat systems to identify and strike hostile targets. This is achieved through fastest possible processing and analysis of unlimited sensor data to facilitate predictive decision-making and proactive targeting. The ethical aspect of the man-in-the-loop is, however, important. Otherwise, a combination of autonomous, unmanned systems, robotics, and artificial intelligence can run riot. Pentagon doctrine also mandates that no lethal force is authorized without the human in the loop. In fact, Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla and SpaceX, has said that artificial intelligence is more dangerous than nuclear warheads, while Russian President Putin has reportedly opined that nation that leads in artificial intelligence technology will be the ruler of the world. US and China are leading efforts in the field of AI, and China aims to become the world leader in this field by 2030. Likewise, our MOD has set up the Defense AI Project Agency to guide efforts in this direction. Cybersecurity is an area of increasing importance in the non-contact battle. If the adversary is able to penetrate networks that are foundational to our defense information, social media, and financial systems, the wars can be won without firing a bullet. PSYOPs shaping the environment, degrading our defense networks, among other disruptions through cyber attacks could cause irreparable damage to our operational capability. Active and passive cyber warfare can be pursued by the adversary in peacetime and even below the threshold of hard kill or kinetic operations to yield exponential gains, right from the strategic to the tactical levels. Disruptive cyber attack systems are increasingly involving personnel outside uniform, and this is adding to the complexities associated with identifying the threats. What complicates matters is that no universally applicable ethical rules have been written pertaining to cyber ops. Until that is done, I feel a more proactive as opposed to a reactive strategy in this area is strongly recommended. Looking at warfare in the space domain, as we have seen, space-based C4I2SR developments are crucial for MDA and net-centric operations. Satellites are also vital for navigation and time signals, unmanned system control, and to execute precision missile strikes. Consequently, space-based capabilities are affecting sea power so extensively that space strategy is increasingly becoming a critical component of naval strategy. The denial of American GPS service remains a threat, and GPS is also susceptible to jamming and spoofing. To tide over these worries, India has developed its space-based navigation system called the NAVIC, with coverage limited to our areas of immediate interest. Militarization of space and use of anti-satellite weapons to blind or destroy adversary satellites poses a serious threat. Apart from use of offensive cyber capabilities to disable space system, directed energy weapons can also be used to disrupt and damage satellite systems. DEWs can cause damage to a target through highly focused energy without using a solid projectile. Lasers, microwaves, particle, and sound beams are some examples. DEW can potentially replace the conventional gun ammunition. This will make the warship safer from damage on board. They are also cost-effective, do not require replenishment, have lesser wear and tear, fire at the speed of light, are virtually silent, and can limit collateral damage. Russia, US, and China have all made major strides in high-energy laser and microwave technologies, which has potential of altering the dynamics of maritime battle. Unmanned systems in air, land, and sea remove human vulnerability and extend the operating envelope in network, multi-domain operations, and in high-risk and demanding hostile environment. Harnessing of swarm drone technology with the ability of the swarm to communicate and coordinate with each other to achieve tactical missions is also proving to be highly disruptive. The swarm can divide workload, undertake saturation attacks against warships and its equipment, and can be operated from motherships. In a document called Force Design 2045, CNO US Navy has again brought out that the world is entering a new age of warfare, where the integration of technology, concepts, partners, and systems, more than the fleet size itself, will determine the victory in conflict, unquote. The strategy brings out that in 2040s and beyond, US Navy is envisioned as a hybrid fleet with more than 350 manned ships, 150 large unmanned surface and subsurface platforms, and approximately 3,000 aircraft. Why am I telling you this? Is because the strategy also envisages augmenting offensive and defensive capability through thousands of small, adaptable, and please note, attritable unmanned platforms. These small and expendable drones will operate in all the three dimensions in vicinity of the ships with an overall aim to enhance the fighting ability of the crewed fleet. India is also invested in the process of developing unmanned systems for the Navy. Now coming to the important aspect of hypersonic weapons, as you all are aware, these fly at speeds of Mach 5 or above, are highly maneuverable, and can change course during flight. They are different from ballistic missiles, which also can travel at hypersonic speeds, but ballistic missiles have set trajectories and limited maneuverability. The ability to launch hypersonic weapons provides considerable advantage because such weapons can evade any defensive system currently in the use in the world. Russia has been pursuing hypersonic weapons technology since the 1980s, and on 19 March 22, you may recall, it became the first nation to use its air-launched Kinzhal hypersonic missile in combat against Ukraine. Russia is also operating the hypersonic glide vehicle Avangard with nuclear capability and is developing Zircon, a ship-launched hypersonic cruise missile. China and US have also undertaken tests of hypersonic weapons. Russian officials look at nuclear-armed hypersonic craft as a hedge against the future US ability at shooting down ICBMs. This, ladies and gentlemen, could potentially undermine nuclear deterrence. Chinese military, in contrast, sees hypersonic weapons as well as the cyber warfare and electromagnetic pulse strikes as an assassin's mace, a folklore term for a weapon that gives an advantage against a better armed foe. In a contingency, for example, over Taiwan or South China Sea, China could undertake preemptive strikes with conventional hypersonic weapons to cripple US forces in the Pacific Ocean. As a counter, Pentagon plans to launch hundreds of small satellites with sensors capable of tracking heat sources. The hypersonic and ballistic tracking sensor network could be made operational by 2030. Apart from kinetic interceptors, US is also examining the use of directed energy weapons for countering hypersonic weapons. Ladies and gentlemen, the directed energy countermeasures, you may recall, were also discussed in 1980s as the elements of the US Star Wars missile defense shield, which was subsequently abandoned. Now let us look at some future naval technologies which are driving capabilities within the naval platforms itself. Cutting-edge naval technologies are increasingly finding their way into design and development of future-ready ships, submarines, and aircraft. The Zumwalt-class destroyers of the US Navy, at around 16,000 tons, are bigger than most cruisers, but have extensive stealth features to reduce their RCS, or that is the radar cross-section, to perhaps as low as fishing boats. Likewise, integrated electrical propulsion systems are fitted on Royal Navy's Queen Elizabeth-class carriers, the US Navy's Zumwalt-class destroyers, as well as under construction of the US Navy Columbia-class SSBNs. This propulsion system reduces size and volume of components, eliminates moving parts, and thus reduces noise. These ships are also heavily automated and designed to be operated by a smaller number of crews and are more fuel efficient. Likewise, fitment of DW and rail guns on Zumwalt class, which I had covered earlier, is another innovative change. The DW, of course, on the flip side, requires higher power to operate, which becomes a critical challenge to overcome in naval ship design. Sinking of Russian flagship Moskova in April this year reinforced the necessity of fitment of DW on ships as a countermeasure. US Navy has accordingly asked for accelerating the induction of DE weapons in their warships as a countermeasure. The Columbia-class SSBNs under construction for US Navy are designed for a life of 42 years and are amalgamating a reactor core that would last for the entire lifetime of a ship, thereby ruling out requirement of midlife refueling. It would also have relatively maintenance-free shafts, which will increase their availability and operation cycle. Its underwater detection capabilities are also planned for substantial improvement with use of new techniques that do not rely on noise of a submarine, but on use of lower frequency active sonar and non-acoustic methods of detecting submarine wakes at short ranges. Similarly, the Ford class of the US Navy is planned to modernize carrier operations with 23 new technologies on board. Important well-known additions are the EMOLs and the advanced arrestor gear. These will enable launch and recovery of a wider range of manned and unmanned aircraft more reliably and at much faster sortie generation rates. In conclusion, I would say that as we can see, sci-fi movies of yesteryears with their believe it or not multi-domain battle scenarios are already progressively playing out today. The ongoing revolution in military affairs being brought in through path-breaking technologies will mandate us to adapt, or if we do not learn, to perish if we aim to fight the wars of today with technologies of yesterday. Indian Navy has been developing capabilities and inducting technologies in crucial areas progressively in accordance with the Maritime Capability Perspective Plan. Likewise, future capability accretion will be undertaken through integrated capability development plans with budgetary support based on a 10-year model as against 15 years earlier. This will cater for the rapid change in technology and help to tide over obsolescence. Advanced nations that are ahead on the technology curve will be reluctant to share niche technologies with others, including India. Therefore, indigenous R&D, DRDO, defense PSUs, private companies, and academia will need to sustain the ongoing concentrated efforts under the Atmanirbhar Bharat and the Make in India initiative of the Government of India. Opportunities of licensed production in India, where equipment is being offered to plug capability gaps, will also need to be pursued. India has progressed steadfastly in designing and inducting ships, aircraft, weapons, and sensors. Substantial experience has been gained by the Warship Design Bureau, Defense and Public Shipyards, BEL, ADA, DRDO, and HAL as a part of this process. Commissioning of INS Vikrant with 76% indigenous content has put India in a league of select few nations who have this niche capability and has been instrumental in developing and nurturing a large ecosystem of technology-intensive industries and MSMEs. The development of indigenous twin-based deck fighter to operate from indigenous carrier in the coming years will take the effort of indigenization to the next desired level. I would like to end my talk with a very valid point made by P.W. Singer, the author of The Ghost Fleet, a novel of the next World War. During some interviews, he has brought out that future defense and naval technology will provoke us to ask all sorts of tough questions on everything from tactics to strategy to law to ethics to doctrine to military to organization and recruitment. Lessons of history, ladies and gentlemen, in war fighting from the olden times that will perhaps hold true is that the winner will not necessarily be the first who gets the technology or the one with the best or most technology. In fact, it will be the one who is able to package it together with the correct doctrine. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Jai Hind.
Thank you very much, Admiral. And that was just like the previous session, previous speaker, Admiral Ashok Kumar, not only a tour de force, but also a manifestation of our belief that the nation and its maritime aspirations are in excellent hands. So let me once again place on record my own gratitude, and I am sure I echo that of everybody else here as well. So now we will turn the topics over to the audience for interaction, questions and answers. And please keep your questions focused and succinct so that the maximum number can be answered. I'll hand over the proceedings right now for control to the tech team. Yes, I can see the first question coming up immediately. May I request the participant, the panelists, to please mute their mics until the questions are crossed to you. Otherwise, there'll be an echo.
Good afternoon, sir. So my name is Prisham Anurag Sudan. As mentioned by the panel, China is harnessing technologies related to space and cyber and rocket systems, as also to develop state-of-the-art weapon systems. My question is, what could be the roadmap for India to counter this emerging threat?
What we'll do is we'll take a couple of questions together and then hand them across to distribute them across to the panelists. Next question, please.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Midshipman Guddu Mansingh, and my question is that in the Indian Ocean region, it has been a hotbed of piracy, terrorism, and other non-traditional threats. Sir, how does India evolve? How does India evolve such a force structure in order to counter these non-traditional threats? Sir, further, the effects of climate change causing a rise in the sea level has been a strategic vulnerability for the island nations. Sir, what is our role in the Indian Ocean region?
Thank you, and we can have one more question.
Good afternoon to the chair and all the panel members. Sir, my question is, with Indo-Pacific being the new fulcrum of global maritime interest, and while you mentioned the mission-based deployment, how should Indian Navy balance its posture between expanding its footprint vis-a-vis countering the traditional and non-traditional threats in the Indian Ocean region to remain the preferred security partner?
Right. So we've got 3 questions. I will request the Commandant to address the first one, but perhaps I will request Admiral Ashok Kumar if he could tackle the second and third questions to begin with, and then we'll turn it across to the Commandant. Because both these are quite closely linked, they're trying to find out what kind of force mix ought we to be aiming for in order to handle climate change, maritime crime, including piracy, and general non-traditional threats. Ashok, would you like to take a stab at that? Thank you.
Good afternoon, sir. I would like to repeat my question. China is harnessing technology in space, cyber, and rocket systems.
Please wait. Let the panelists answer the first 3 questions. So, Admiral Ashok Kumar, maybe you can answer the ones with regard to the force mix that will enable us to best handle non-traditional threats ranging from climate change across to maritime crime and terrorism and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That's an interesting question. In fact, I had briefly touched upon that in my 20 minutes as well. But having said that, one of the strengths of naval ships is versatility. And so whenever a ship leaves harbor for any mission, that ship is prepared to undertake any other mission at no notice at all when deployed. So that is the first point that I want to make. Second, I had also mentioned about, can we as a nation, or any nation for that matter, afford to have a separate force to deal with conventional threats and a separate force to deal with non-traditional threats? That's firstly, it doesn't make financial sense. And secondly, when somebody is deployed for a non-traditional threat, like for example, take the case of our Gulf of Aden deployments since October of 2008. As and when a conventional threat looms large, or when there is a threat of the balloon going up, he's not going to be a vested entity. He has a part to play in whatever operations may come its way. So therefore, not only is he a capable combatant, but he's also a fully armed to the teeth kind of a vessel which is there. So you mentioned about expanding footprint and dealing with non-traditional threats. In fact, both go hand in hand, because as I mentioned, all non-traditional threats are multinational in character, transnational in character. Therefore, there is a requirement for us to deal with it with a wide footprint deployment of ours. It is not without reason that we undertake EZ patrols of a number of countries whose capacities don't permit them to patrol the vast EZs that they have in dealing with non-traditional threats. And because they are not, transnational in nature, what could be a threat to them is a threat to us too. So that's my larger point, or insofar as handling non-traditional threats is concerned. And when it comes to climate change, yes, that's a threat. In fact, the island territories could be under threat of kind of being subsumed, or at least losing part of their land. So this is something that nations have to be prepared for. Insofar as we are concerned, we have got a huge HADR capability. Even our normal ships, the versatility of our ships that I mentioned, even when our normal ships deploy, they're capable of undertaking HADR missions. And so both people into the future is a threat that one needs to be prepared for. And there are multilateral structures like the IONS, for example, or the IORA, or other smaller ones, whether it is BIMSTEC or the Colombo Security Conclave, or the mini laterals that they have, that we have, or we are a part of, all of them deal with such issues, and there are these kind of standard operating procedures which are attempted to be put in place to deal with such issues as well.
Thank you very much. And let me turn the first question over to Admiral Puneet Bahal.
So I think the question pertained to the fact that the Chinese are making rapid strides in technology, and they are inducting state-of-art weapon and equipment and platforms. So what is the Indian Navy's thought in terms of the roadmap? So I think the part of it I had answered as a part of my talk, but the fact of the matter is that at the MOD level also we have a technology capability perspective roadmap. Also what is important is that we have to do our force structure planning, which is based on the capabilities that we assess. So it is not that you target your capabilities only at specific enemies, because who are today enemies may not be your enemies tomorrow, and vice versa. So therefore, if you need certain technologies, firstly, it is important to be aware as to what are the technologies which are available. So for that, we have agencies within the Navy which are doing a fair bit of research, and they write papers, they conduct a lot of studies, and they throw up the results of these, which are examined at the level of the headquarters by the various professional directorates. And we also have our own, of course, service-related indigenization roadmaps which exist, and we also have indigenization roadmaps. So all these are existing, and we progress according to them, and therefore what is required is subsequently the budgetary support. So that is the other aspect, and I did mention to you that there are certain technologies which will be in the realm of something which you do not have at that moment, and therefore you also have to scout around and see how is your indigenous R&D which has shaped up, or do you have some other cooperative engagement which is available. I think we are in a happy sort of a spot to note that a lot of things, good things are actually happening under the Atmanirbhar Bharat and the indigenization efforts which are going on at the national level. The government of India is totally seized of the matter, and a lot of our DRDO projects, R&D projects, in fact, the private companies are also coming in. But yes, there is a requirement to plow more money into R&D and academia interaction, etc. All those things are happening. So insofar as the software, artificial intelligence, and drone technology is concerned, we have made a fair bit of progress. In terms of artificial intelligence, as I mentioned, we have again got a roadmap which is going, and we have set up an agency. And the other aspect, as I mentioned, is the hardware itself, where there was a gap. But today the state is that we are producing ships increasingly in our own shipyards. In fact, most of the hulls are made here, and we have companies, both PSUs as well as the private sector, which are meeting the requirement of indigenous equipment, sensors, and even weapons increasingly. So that is another area which has developed, but there is some more scope for improvement, and I'm sure we are moving on those lines.
Thank you very much, and we still have a little bit of time, so we can turn to one more round of questions if you don't mind. Also, while we wait for the audience to respond, I do want to make one mention of a question that has come up from an online viewer, where he said that Admiral Bahal talked about full integrated electric propulsion, and that many world-class navies have already adopted this technology. And is India lagging? And if it is lagging, then why? What is the cause for that? So we'll just slot that into the list. In the meanwhile, let's have the next question from the audience.
Good morning, sir. EMP weapons are more potent and cause less damage to population. What is your take on developing EMP missile, VOV, continental stroke strategic missiles?
Okay, and we can go ahead with one more question, and then that's it.
Good afternoon, sir. as mentioned, the highly developed technologies like robots, drones, missile systems, they need a highly skilled personnel to operate them effectively. How the Navy is planning to develop such skills in the personnels?
Okay, that I think was a bit of a rhetorical question, because the very fact that you are where you are is a manifestation of the Indian Navy's intent to develop the manpower with the requisite skills to handle high technology future weapon sensor suites. But we have a couple of questions that do need perhaps some responses. The first of these is with regards to the full spectrum electric propulsion question, and then we will talk about perhaps the business of EMP missiles and cyber capabilities. I will leave it to the panel to decide who will address what, but let me make a small suggestion that in terms of cyber capabilities, perhaps I will request Admiral Ashok Kumar to take the lead.
Can I have the question again, sir? Because it was technological, I kind of switched off.
Yes, well, basically the question was that given the predominance of cyber space in future war, what might be the approach that the Indian Navy has already adopted, and what is the approach that the Indian Navy might adopt in the future to be able to deal with this. Also, there's one point that, for a long while, if you don't mind my prefacing your answer, for a long while we've been listening to this comment that future wars will not be about armies and navies and air forces. Future wars will be about banking system collapses and airports, aircraft not being able to operate, and road vehicles being stuck because of lethal attack, non-lethal attacks to cyber infrastructure. And yet we have the Ukraine conflict, which has been going on now for 6 months. So I sometimes wonder what everybody has been smoking all these months. But that doesn't imply that in any way cyber is not important and not a predominant feature. It's just that it's not going to be the only feature. The character of war might change, but the nature of war remains unchanged across many millennia. So Ashok, maybe you can take it up from there. You need to unmute.
Yeah, yes, sir. There are a number of measures which all the three services have taken. In fact, I'm sure you are aware as to how we now have a tri-service cybersecurity division, and also verticals in each of the three services dealing with it. The place that I am now in, the National Security Council Secretariat, has the National Cyber Security Coordinator as well. So he deals with a lot of this, and the tri-service element and the three service elements conduct quite routinely defensive cyber audits and exercises to validate the standard operating procedures that are in place to ensure a better posture, if not 100% security, although 100% security is the aim. So I think we are doing fine. In fact, all the three services are doing well. That's one. That's it, sir. Is there anything else you want me to add?
No, I think we'll turn it across to the Commandant for the second question. Thank you so much, Ashok, as usual. And the second question that I would very much like Admiral Bahel to address is this business of whether the Indian Navy is well astern of the world's navies in terms of developing full integrated electric propulsion, because without that you cannot surge your power to be able to operate directed energy weapons and so on and so forth. So Admiral Bahel, that and the question about the about whether the correct thrust is being given on class of missile technology, and whether kinetic or, for that matter, hypersonic glide or hypersonic non-glide missilery is the answer, or an EMP missile? Thank you.
So in terms of the integrated electric propulsion, what has happened is, the certain countries like US and even UK have actually taken the lead in this. The Chinese are doing it in a big way, as you're aware that their third aircraft carrier will be, which is going to be 100,000 tons. They are looking at electric propulsion to power that. So India is also studying this, and it has done a lot of work in taking this integrated electric propulsion forward. In fact, in the LPTs which are likely to come out, they most likely will have the integrated electric propulsion. So that is where we are, and yes, we are looking at this very, very carefully in terms of powering our future platforms because of the inherent advantages of IEP, which I covered as a part of my talk. So that was one question, sir.
Yes, and the second question was about the missiles.
So insofar as the missile technology is concerned, we are looking at, as you are aware, I think it's open source knowledge that India is also looking at developing faster missiles and therefore adapting technologies which are already existing. And I think it's a matter of time. In fact, when I say time, it's a matter of few years, then we would look at hypersonic weapons, which would come in perhaps in the decade itself. That's the open source reading I have. Now, that is something which absolutely needs to be done, because what happens is that if these missiles are proliferating all around you, therefore you have to ensure that the system gets balanced, and therefore you build that deterrence at various levels. So that is work in progress. Insofar as the EMP is concerned, yes, that is another area which we need to develop. But as of now, what is the progress in EMP? I actually offhand don't have any information on that. But yes, we are looking at all these technologies which have to come in, and which EMP, of course, was developed many years back. If I were to remember, I think in somewhere in the end 90s, there were simulated exercises being done in US even that time, where they had looked at in what manner the destruction or disabling of satellites and sending out of an EMP pulse would sort of affect the operations. And I remember one particular incident which we had discussed at that point in time, that in 1997, in an army exercise, they had done this disruption of the satellite, and they had also launched the EMP weapon, which had degraded the capability of the force to get the inputs in terms of the information or the domain information by almost 50% at that time. So yes, that is another area where we need to look at, and I'm sure there is some work going on, although the level of the work and involvement offhand, I do not have information on that.
Right, thank you very much. It is also important to remember that right now hypersonic glide vehicles, as well as swarm drones being operated in swarm mode, in swarming, utilizing swarming tactics, are in fact being shown up to be not as invincible as one would have thought only a couple of months ago. Once again, the Ukraine crisis shows that Russia has been deploying satellite-based jamming capabilities of an order that I think even Starlinks had not factored while assessing the effectiveness of the communication satellites that are up there. So I think that the questions have been rather accurately and succinctly answered, and I think that I do need to express my own gratitude once again, echoing the sentiments of, I'm sure, everybody who's both online and within the auditorium. And now with your permission, it is very difficult for me to try and sum up all of this, but I'm going to sacrifice a couple of minutes of my time to ask Professor Kondapalli, whom we rather abruptly lost, whether he would like to address any of the questions that were asked in the first session, or would he like to do that offline?
Thank you, sir. I would like to attempt the queries that were raised on Iran and Russia. At the moment, the Chinese have Iran as the member of the SCO, which was cleared up in Samarkand meeting. It will take some time, of course, to stabilize the situation in terms of the bureaucratic structures within the SCO. But the Chinese also have a $250 billion agreement with Iran, especially in the BRI projects, Belt and Road Initiative, and others. Thirdly, the Chinese are part of the EU 3+3 with Iran on the nuclear issue. Of course, it is a problematic area during the Trump administration and currently in the Biden administration. Nevertheless, the Chinese are getting a lot of contracts in the nuclear energy projects in Iran. There is also the other nuclear and ballistic missile footprint that China has in Isfahan nuclear facility, and also in terms of the Tondor missile systems and the C-801 cruise missiles that Iran acquired. So there is a certain China-Iran angle to this, and Strait of Hormuz, once in a while the Iranians threaten to blockade this because of the American pressure, but China is also a loser in that kind of a scenario. So the China-Iran issue is still an area where we have not been able to get very explicit cooperation. There are some areas, but still there is the issue here. On Russia, the February 4th announcement on limitless cooperation or limitless partnership, but still, when you look at the overall trade that China has with other countries, maritime trade, nearly $3 to $4 trillion compared to $220 billion with Russia. While China still gets a lot of advanced equipment from Russia, including S-400, Kilo class, 12 of the Kilo class, previously Sovremeny class of destroyers, and the first aircraft carrier came from Ukraine, Varyag, and now there is a lot that China is doing on the aircraft carrier programs. So Russia is still the major supplier of systems, if not platforms recently. Nevertheless, this is an area where there are still problems for China, specifically as the NATO has issues with China on Ukraine-Russia invasion. So that is the China-Russia connection. There is a rethinking in China on both Iran and Russia. China uses this for multipolarity, but nevertheless, there is also a certain limit because of the heavy dependence on globalization, especially on maritime trade related issues.
You're muted, sir.
I'm sorry. I said that I'm going to seek the indulgence of the commandant, taking completely unfair advantage of the fact that he's also a panelist, and seek a few minutes in which I might make some points of summation. So, Puneet, if it's okay by you, just raise your hand. Otherwise, I will close the session.
Yes, please, sir. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. So, what I would like to do is offer some comments about the main issues with regard to the many points that were raised in today's session. And I'm going to try and share my presentation across. I'm not sure whether you can see that, and if the tech team would please tell me whether you can see this or not.
Yes, sir, we'll guide you through. So you have to click on the present icon.
Okay, you need me to share a window. Okay, doing that. And can you see that now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the first point which was made today was about AUKUS, which I wish to talk about. And this was important because AUKUS is in fact a security issue, and it is Everybody knows about the first element. It has two lines of effort, and everyone is aware of the first line and talked about them with regard to submarines and Australia's acquisition in sometime in the next 2 decades of conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines. But of consequence to India, and this bears upon the many excellent points made by Admiral Behel, is the fact that advanced capabilities is the second thrust area in terms of the AUKUS partnership. And here there's lots of room for engagement, lots of room to be partnering the UK, the US and Australia by countries like India. And if you look at the main thrust lines for the advanced technologies, they're all extremely relevant to India, both in terms of collaboration as well as in terms of independent development, which could then be integrated. So there's undersea capabilities, quantum technologies, AI and autonomy in contested environments, advanced offensive and defensive cyber capabilities, hypersonic and counter-hypersonic capabilities, EW innovation and information sharing. So now the question that arises several times is that should we be worrying or should we sulk at being excluded from the AUKUS? And the answer is, of course, not, because does this business of AUKUS having annoyed France and the European Union, doesn't it provide us with greater strategic autonomy? And for our technology needs, we can also now turn in collaborative needs. We can turn to France, Germany, and Japan, in addition to maintaining our ties with Australia, the UK, and the US. And that is precisely what is meant by strategic autonomy. So when we just recently had the second India-Japan 2+2 meet, for example, in September last month, it is Japan who was making all the overtures to India to seek technological collaboration with us. So what is it that AUKUS actually allows us to do? Most importantly of all, AUKUS buys us the additional time that we need vis-a-vis China. And for all members of the audience, whether online or offline, the question really is, what are we doing with the time that we have bought? And when we're talking about dealing with China, the Bombay question arises frequently. That is that if we were to be nicer to China, then would China be nicer to us? And if we were to trade more with China and have China trade more with India, would our chances of conflict reduce? I would very strongly suggest that we have a look at additional documentation than that being pumped out by only one or the other ministry of the government of India. And if you look at Catherine Barbieri's rather exquisite book, The Liberal Illusion, she indicates quite clearly that trade does not, especially dyadic trade, does not in fact promote peace. So in case of China, this has already been mentioned by Professor Kondapalli as well as by the other speakers, to say that China's historical concept of being the Middle Kingdom surrounded by barbarian states whose sole raison d'etre is to pay obeisance and tribute to China provides contemporary China with a defining sense of national identity. And therefore, if you were to be nicer to China, China merely looks at you and says, who are you? Are you a supplicant? And if you're a supplicant, your job is to supplicate. My job is to knock your head off. So China is quite a lot like Queen Cersei in the Game of Thrones. And so the apparent lack of any pushback against China's incrementally expanding claims over geographical areas generates not a reciprocal approach, but actually simply generates disdain. And this is something that Mr. Amit Bhandari alluded to when he talked about the Belt and Road. So what is it that compels in China to currently or in the future operate increasingly in the Indian Ocean region? And I would like to once again draw upon what was mentioned by Amit Bhandari when he said that China's movements are problematic in a number of areas, but they are driven by the demands of domestic stability. Now, this diagram shows you the 15-inch isohyet. An isohyet is a line joining places of equal rainfall, and you need 15 inches of rainfall to be able to sustain an agricultural economy. And if you look at China's population, which Amit mentioned again, you will see that it is concentrated, the Han Chinese population is concentrated east and south of the 15-inch isohyet, whereas the belts are all running into the north and western segments where the per capita income is between 10 and 50% less than the national mean. And you can see that more clearly in this slide showing you the land suitability for rain-fed and irrigated cereal production, which now shows you that China is actually in very large trouble. China may be on the brink of a major food shortage, triggering a strategic contest over food security. They've had, of course, the normal COVID-19 induced disruptions, catastrophic flooding in the Yangtze River Basin. They've had 3 or 4 huge typhoons. They've got a heat wave, locust swarms, fall armyworm infestations. If I was China, I would be very unhappy because its ability to sustain economic growth via a domestically driven economic model currently is very nearly zero. And therefore, as the engine of China's economic growth demands ever greater resources of raw material and petroleum-based energy, all our speakers have emphasized that China has really no option but to rely increasingly upon merchandise trade, 90% of which is seaborne, 50% travels across the Indian Ocean. And if you were in Beijing and this conference was taking place there, you would recognize that of a GDP, nominal GDP of 18 trillion, almost 6 trillion is accounted for by external merchandise trade, 90%, 5.4 trillion is seaborne, and therefore any given month, something like 450 billion dollars worth of Chinese trade is upon the sea, and I rather doubt you'll be able to sleep very well. The question to be asked, therefore, is whether China's operational center of gravity is in fact her merchandise maritime trade. And when China looks seaward, it sees a horrendous picture because unlike India, China has arguably the worst maritime geography on the planet. It is surrounded by people who are certainly not its best friends. One more point about this whole business of Gwadar, again, drawing from what Mr. Amit Bhandari had indicated. I want you as naval officers, current and in the making, to think about and to track what is happening in Gwadar vis-a-vis draft, vis-a-vis depth alongside. So Gwadar alongside draft was increased in 2020 to 14.4 meters, and that only permits the berthing of 70,000 deadweight ton ships. Now, you know that a VLCC has 250,000 deadweight tons, and you have a current container carrying capacity of a standard container carrying vessel today is of the order of 19 to 20,000 TEU. Second, Gwadar is at sea level, and Amit has correctly pointed out that the Kunjrab Pass is at 4,700 meters above sea level, and this is therefore an impossibility. But the point I want to make is you all need, and all of us need, to start studying Gwadar vis-a-vis dredging. Now, Pakistan can't ask for dredgers as part of a secret plan. It has to issue a global tender, and therefore that is amenable to monitoring by us. On a typical day, despite the 3 pipelines feeding into China, namely the ESPO, the Kazakhstan China pipeline, and the Made terminal Chokfu across to Kunming pipeline, they together can account for less than 15% of China's current oil imports. And so on a typical day, we have between 30 and 35 VLCCs only in the Indian Ocean, all bound for Chinese ports. That would be panic. What about this business of Djibouti and the whole business of places and bases? Djibouti is going to see, I think, in the next couple of years, Chinese aircraft carriers, not because they are capable of deploying in the Indian Ocean, which they are not for battle, but because you need deck landing qualifications by night. And therefore, the only diversionary airfield available within the Indian Ocean to China is Djibouti. I want to also make a mention of the fact that, as all the 4 speakers have mentioned, it is planning as opposed to execution of future war in the maritime domain that is crucial. There's no use India worrying about chess. China doesn't play chess. Chinese strategists play the game of Go. How many Indians play the game of Go? It will give you an answer to how cleverly we are able to counter China before China makes her moves. So in planning for future conflict, it's not only that it's hard to be spatially surprised, but you can certainly be temporally surprised. That means surprised in place of time, which means that if your long term is China's short term, and China's short term is longer than your long term, then I'm afraid you're in for strategic surprise. Admiral Behel has in very detailed and exquisite fashion talked about the future operational and tactical environment as shaped by technology, and the question that is being pumped out by China, and I think this is part of strategic communication rather than anything else, is that they are in the middle of developing, or in the final throes of developing, what Krepinevich calls the mature precision strike regime, which permits which makes the existence of major fleet combatants doubtful. I think we are far away from that. Admiral Bell talked about laser and directed energy weapons, and that ties in, as we have seen in the Q&A session, to the whole business of full electric propulsion. And you need these huge surges of electric power if you're going to be developing railgun, hyper velocity projectiles, or directed energy weapons. India is not lagging behind, and much as people seem to think, we are actually quite obviously present in the lead amongst the leading nations of the world in moving from kinetic weapons to directed energy weapons and sensor suites. Likewise, a lot of emphasis has been laid by Admiral Ashok Kumar as well as by the audience on the business of cyberspace operations. And as Admiral Ashok Kumar has pointed out quite clearly, we are not laggards here either. Finally, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the indicative strategies that we have, particularly in times of tension. In times of tension, our main strategy for India must necessarily be distraction, preventing the eye of Sauron from focusing solely upon the Indian Ocean. So therefore, for us, the South China Sea must simmer, but it must not boil over. For us, the Taiwan crisis must keep Beijing preoccupied, but an actual invasion, either out of desperation or miscalculation, must not occur. For us, Japan must be continuously engaging China in the East China Sea with regard to the Xinjiao gas fields and the Senkaku Islands. For us, it is really good news when Ishigaki Island develops or is equipped with M11 missiles, because if you look at the pecked red lines, that's Ningbo, which is the headquarters of the East Sea Fleet of China. And so long as Japan is engaging in this fashion, it is very hard for the East Sea Fleet and the South Sea Fleet to merge, all of which is good for us. For us, the USA must remain engaged in the Western and Southern Pacific. If this means that we have to continue our relationship with the USA at all costs, then I think that that's the answer. Likewise, AUKUS for us must be played up so that it continues to engage China's attention. And when the pen is not mighty enough, then the Indian Navy must be able to lead our nation in drawing the sword and moving into areas of conflict. And for all of you, the last point that I want to make is that conflict considerations are, it is obvious that two armies don't go to war, two navies don't go to war, two air forces don't go to war, two nations go to war. But then what are the various combinations of circumstances or happenstances that would convince the government of India that this is not some army skirmish. This is not some land-air battle or some air-land battle, but the Republic of India is in a state of armed conflict with the Republic of China or the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. Suppose you're a dove, you don't want war. Okay, then you must know the answer to this question so that you can avoid that combination of circumstances. Suppose you're a hawk, you do want war. Okay, then you must know the answer to this question so that you can engineer these circumstances. But if you don't know the answer, then I'm afraid you will simply blunder into war. And when we talk about Pakistan and China, we all know where China wants us to fight. We don't want to fight there. We want China to come to our killing grounds, not we going to their killing ground. And therefore, when we talked about KT Bandar, which we didn't talk about, and it was astonishing that we should be focused solely upon Gwadar, look where KT Bandar is and look at that place called Thar Parkar. This is owned by China. This is a power plant. It is owned by China. 750 Chinese people live here. And this is the fourth largest coal deposit mines in all of Asia. And therefore, when we are looking at targeting and studying and establishing what China is doing with the CPOC, we tend to omit the activities taking place in Thar Parker, and yet Thar Parker is very much part of the Chinese declared CPOC. It is the only one occurring in the Pakistani province of Sindh. Finally, are all these logistic bases, are bases the same as places? What's the difference between a place and a base? Guys, a place is any location which in times of peace will allow you to shape operations, increase surveillance, improve intelligence, enhance your logistic capability in times of peace. A base, a military base must be capable of being defended in times of war. How the heck is China going to defend Djibouti or Eritrea or some location in times of conflict? And therefore, you have to figure out whether these are places, whether these are bases, and we must be very careful about the terminology that we use, because history will forgive us for many things. But if one feature of the whole Dilli series of seminars has taught us is this: history will not forgive us for one type of failure, and that is failures of imagination. And with that, I'd better stop sharing and stop talking and ask you to join me in once again putting your hands together in appreciation for the excellent presentations that we heard from our four panelists. Thank you very much. You deserve a very big hand, but will you please settle for two small ones clapping like hell? Thank you very much, Tech Team. It's over to you. I thank you for the opportunity to have moderated quite so scintillating a session. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, and thank you very much to the entire esteemed panel for the wonderful deliberations today. We may now sign off, sir. Thank you.
Thank you once again. Bye.